Some men hide their greatest truths not in a safe, not in a vault, but inside the bones of a machine they loved more than anything in the world. And sometimes, the only person who finds it is a stranger with grease on his hands and no reason to care. Ethan Pierce had no idea that a rusted 1967 Mustang sitting in a city impound lot was about to drag him into someone else's war. A war that had been waiting 7 years for the right person to stumble into it. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, and let's go. The impound lot on Desmond Avenue smelled the way all impound lots smell. Oil soaked into gravel, rust in the air. The faint chemical bite of old antifreeze baking under a summer sun that had no business being that aggressive at 8 in the morning. Ethan Pierce walked the rows with a paper coffee cup going cold in his hand and a printed sheet from the auction listing folded twice in his back pocket, and he was already starting to think he'd made a mistake coming out here. He'd driven 40 minutes. The listing had said 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, non-running, condition unknown, minimum bid $800. He'd seen worse descriptions. He'd also been burned before by descriptions exactly like that one. Cars that looked like they had bones worth saving until you got under the hood and realized someone had already picked them clean. He found it in the third row, between a crumpled Civic that had clearly lost an argument with something much larger and a white panel van with both rear doors missing. The Mustang sat low on flat tires, the front end pointing slightly left like it had been nudged into that spot without much ceremony. The Highland green paint, or what was left of it, had gone the color of old jade, bleached and flaking in patches along the roof and hood. The rear quarter panel on the driver's side showed a crease that ran from the wheel arch up toward the trunk lid. The windshield had a crack that started at the lower left corner and traveled diagonally until it disappeared under the rear view mirror bracket. Ethan stood there for a moment and just looked at it. He'd been restoring cars for 11 years. 11 years since he'd taken over the lease on the garage on Carnell Street from a man named Dutch Hooper, who decided at 63 that he was done dealing with the public and wanted to spend his remaining years fishing. Ethan had been 29 then, working for Dutch on wages that didn't quite cover rent, sleeping on a cot in the back office for 4 months until he could afford a real apartment. He hadn't planned to become a restorer. He'd planned to be a mechanic, which is what he was, but old cars had a way of getting their hooks into you, and once they did, you stopped fighting it. He walked around the Mustang slowly, one full circuit. He crouched at the front to look under the bumper. He put his hand on the hood and felt the metal, warmer already from the morning sun than it should be, which meant the insulation under the hood liner was gone or compromised. He tried the driver's door. It opened, which surprised him, the hinges complaining but not seizing. The interior was in rough shape. The driver's seat had split along the seam at the top, the foam beneath it gone orange with age, and someone had draped an old moving blanket over the seat at some point before it got impounded. The blanket was still there, stiff and molded to the contours of the cushion like it had been there for years. The steering wheel was intact. The dash pad had cracked in the heat, deep fissures running across the top. The carpet was shot. He sat in the driver's seat without really thinking about it, the way you do sometimes with old cars, just settling into them to get a sense of the proportions, the feel of the wheel in your hands at the right angle. The smell hit him a second after he sat down. Not rot, not mildew, though there was some of that too. Something underneath, something like paper, old paper, and something faintly chemical, like the inside of an old filing cabinet. He noticed it and then filed it away. He got out, went around to the back, and checked the trunk. It was empty except for a rusted scissor jack and a spare that had gone completely flat, the sidewall starting to crack. He checked the floor of the trunk. No rust through, which was better than he expected. He knocked on the wheel wells, solid. He popped the hood latch from inside and lifted it. The engine was a 390 FE big block. He knew it immediately. The configuration, the valve covers, the general layout of it. It was dirty, and it had clearly been sitting, and the air filter housing was missing entirely, but the block itself looked complete. Someone hadn't stripped it. That mattered. Ethan stepped back and looked at the whole car from 10 feet away. He thought about what it would take. He thought about what it was worth if he got it right. A 67 Fastback in good condition with a matching numbers big block, fully restored, could bring $80,000 to $100,000 from the right buyer. He thought about the crease in the quarter panel and whether that was body filler underneath or actual metal damage, and whether the frame behind it had taken any of the impact. He thought about the floor pans and whether they were going to need replacing. He thought about the $800 minimum bid and the fact that most of the other bidders today were going to be part scavengers who just wanted the engine or the transmission and wouldn't push the price up much. He pulled out his phone and took 12 photos, then walked back to the auction office to register his paddle. He got the car for $1,240. The parts scavengers had pushed it a little. One of them, a heavy-set guy in a king's cap who seemed to know what he was looking at, had taken it to $1,150 before dropping out. Ethan had been prepared to go to $1,800. He didn't say that out loud. He arranged transport through a flatbed service he'd used before. A guy named Reggie, who ran 2 trucks and charged fair rates and didn't ask questions about why you were moving a car that clearly wasn't going to move on its own. The Mustang arrived at Carnell Street that afternoon, sitting up on the flatbed with its flat tires and its cracked windshield. And Ethan's assistant, a 24-year-old named Darren, who had opinions about everything, stood in the bay door with his arms crossed and studied it. "That's a lot of car to fix," Darren said. "That's kind of the point. The paint's completely gone on the roof." "I know." "And the quarter panel." "Darren, I know." Ethan guided Reggie as he backed the flatbed up toward the lift. "Get me the inflation gun. I want to see where those tires are." Darren got the inflation gun and they worked together to get the Mustang off the flatbed and onto the shop floor, rolling it on tires that had enough air to move but not enough to trust. They put it on the lift and raised it about 18 inches, enough to get a good look at the undercarriage without fully committing to a full inspection. And Ethan spent 20 minutes going over the floor pans, the frame rails, the suspension points. The frame was straight. The floor pans had surface rust but no penetration. The front crossmember was solid. He lowered the car and stood looking at it in the better light of the shop interior. Under fluorescence, the paint damage was more obvious. Not just fading, but actual checking, the clear coat long gone and the color code underneath starting to separate. But the body lines were intact. The fastback roofline swept back exactly the way it was supposed to. Even sitting flat on dead tires with cracked glass and split upholstery, the car had a presence that most modern cars spent their entire existence failing to achieve. "All right," Ethan said. "Let's start pulling it apart." The systematic disassembly of an old car is not a romantic process. It is largely a process of discovering every decision that was made in the car's previous life. Every repair, every shortcut, every bit of damage that someone had covered up rather than fixed. You learn to read a car the way some people claim to read faces, not what it presents on the surface, but what it's been through. The first week went like this. Ethan pulled the engine and transmission and set them aside on stands. He removed the interior, seats, carpet, door panels, headliner, and piled the salvageable material in one corner and the lost causes in the trash. He took the hood off. He took the doors off and hung them on his door rack. He removed the front bumper and the rear bumper and the trim pieces along the rockers. What he found underneath was, generally speaking, better than expected. There was some previous bodywork on the passenger side front fender. Someone had done a repair at some point, not badly. And the crease in the driver's rear quarter panel turned out to be sheet metal damage without frame involvement, which was the best possible outcome. The car had led a hard life, but it hadn't been abused systematically. It had been neglected, which was a different thing. On the 4th day, with the dash out, and the console removed and the carpet pulled up and sitting in a pile against the wall, Ethan was going through the firewall area, checking the wiring harness, noting what was original and what had been spliced at some point, when his hand found something wrong. Not wrong exactly. Unexpected. He was running his hand along the inside of the dash structure, above where the glove box sat, feeling for rust or damage in the metal behind it, when his fingers found a section that didn't feel like the surrounding metal. It had a different resonance when he tapped it, less hollow than the areas on either side. He leaned in with his flashlight and looked. There was a panel there. Not a factory panel. Factory metal doesn't have small countersunk screws at the corners. 4 of them, small, the slots slightly worn from whatever tool had opened and closed them before. The panel itself was the same color as the surrounding dash metal. Someone had painted it to match. But the seams were visible now that he was looking for them, and the screws were the giveaway. He went to his bench and got a screwdriver that fit. He came back and crouched beside the stripped dash and removed the 4 screws, working carefully because the slots were worn, and he didn't want to strip them further. The panel came free. Behind it was a compartment about the size of a shoebox, maybe slightly smaller. Not a factory compartment. This had been fabricated and installed by someone who knew what they were doing, fitted into the space behind the dash structure and sealed with that painted panel. Inside the compartment, wrapped in a single layer of bubble wrap that had gone brittle with age, were 2 things. The first was an envelope, standard letter size, white, sealed, with the name Clara written on the front in blue ink. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that comes from someone who doesn't write by hand much and is making the effort. The second was a USB drive, small, black, the kind you could buy in a pack of 5 at any office supply store. It was sitting inside a small Ziploc bag, the kind meant for organizing jewelry or small hardware. Ethan looked at both of them for a long moment without touching them. Then he sat back on his heels and tried to think clearly about what he was looking at. A car that had been sitting in a city impound lot for 7 years. He knew this from the auction records, which listed the initial impoundment date. A hidden compartment. A letter addressed to someone named Clara. A USB drive sealed in a protective bag. Someone had put these here deliberately, carefully, and then the car had gone into impound, either before they could retrieve them or because something had happened to them. He picked up the envelope first. He didn't open it. It wasn't addressed to him, and despite the fact that he'd just bought the car and stripped it to the frame, he had a clear sense that opening someone else's letter was a different order of violation. He turned it over. No return address. No other markings. He picked up the USB drive in its bag. He turned it over. Nothing on it. No label, no markings. He put both items on his workbench, got his phone, and pulled up the auction records again. The car had been impounded on March 14th, 7 years ago. The listed reason for impoundment was abandoned vehicle, private property complaint. The registered owner at the time of impoundment was listed as Victor Langford, with an address in the Morrow Hill neighborhood on the west side of the city. Ethan typed the name into his phone's browser. The first result was an obituary. Victor Langford, 54, had died 14 months after the car had been impounded. The obituary was brief, the kind that reads like it was written by someone who either didn't know the person well or was in too much grief to write more. It mentioned that he was survived by his wife, Clara Langford. Ethan set his phone down and looked at the envelope on the workbench. Clara. He left everything where it was and went to get coffee from the machine at the back of the shop, because he needed a minute to think about this, and he thought better when he was moving. He spent that evening doing what he'd learned to do when a situation didn't have an obvious right answer, which was to think about it practically rather than emotionally. The practical facts were these. He had found, inside a car he'd legally purchased, a letter addressed to a woman named Clara and a USB drive. The letter's intended recipient was almost certainly Clara Langford, wife of the car's previous owner who had died. The car had been in impound for 7 years, which meant Victor Langford had either lost access to it before he died or had not known where it was. The practical question was, what do you do with a dead man's letter to his wife? He thought about dropping it at a post office with a note explaining where he'd found it. He thought about trying to locate Clara Langford directly. He thought about opening the USB drive and seeing if the contents told him anything useful. He thought about calling a lawyer to ask what his legal obligations were here, which felt both correct and somewhat absurd. What he didn't think about doing was throwing it away. That possibility didn't occur to him seriously, which was not something he would have been able to articulate as a statement about his character, but was, in fact, exactly that. He went to bed without resolving anything and lay awake for a while thinking about Victor Langford, who had been 54 when he died, who had hidden something important inside his car, and who had addressed the envelope to his wife in careful, deliberate handwriting as though he'd been taking his time. In the morning, he opened the USB drive. He told himself this was practical, that he needed to understand what was on it before he could figure out what to do with it. He told himself that he wasn't opening the envelope, that the letter was personal, and the drive might just contain documents or information that would help him locate Clara Langford. These were not entirely dishonest rationalizations, but they were rationalizations. He plugged the drive into his laptop at the workbench, the laptop he used for parts research and ordering, running it on the shop's Wi-Fi. The drive contained one folder labeled simply For Clara. Inside the folder were 43 files. Most of them were PDFs. Some were spreadsheets. There were several image files, photographs of documents taken with a phone camera, the angles slightly off in the way that phone photos of paper always are. He opened the first PDF. It was a contract, a business partnership agreement, dated about 9 years ago, between two entities, Langford Development Partners, LLC, and Grayson Capital Group, Inc. The contract itself was dense with the kind of language that means very little to someone without a legal background. Representations and warranties, indemnification clauses, conditions precedent. But the names at the bottom were clear enough. Victor Langford, and someone named Miles Grayson. He opened another file, a spreadsheet. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at, a series of financial transactions, organized by date, with account numbers and transfer amounts. The amounts were not small. He was looking at column after column of transactions in the hundreds of thousands, some of them over $1 million. The destination accounts had names he didn't recognize, shell company names, names that sounded like they had been generated rather than chosen. He opened one of the photo files. It was a photograph of what appeared to be a signature page, a contract page, the kind you see at the end of a legal document. Someone had circled two signatures in red ink and written a note in the margin. Not Victor's signature. Compare with notarized 2014 agreement. The handwriting on the note matched the handwriting on the envelope. Ethan sat back from the laptop. He was not a lawyer. He was not an accountant. He was a mechanic who restored old cars and had a decent head for what things were worth and what they weren't. But he had grown up with a father who had spent 30 years in commercial construction and had talked occasionally about the ways people stole from each other in business, how you could make a company look profitable while draining it through subsidiary accounts, how you could forge a signature on a contract if you had the right access to the original document. His father had described it the way someone describes a natural phenomenon, not with outrage, but with the weary recognition of something that existed in the world. What Ethan was looking at, as far as he could tell, was evidence of systematic financial fraud. A business partner who had apparently been stealing from Victor Langford through transactions routed through accounts that didn't easily trace back to him, contracts with signatures that were not Victor's signatures, financial records that someone had assembled carefully over time, and hidden inside a car in a secret compartment addressed to a woman named Clara. Victor Langford had known someone was robbing him. He had gathered the proof. And then, for whatever reason, whatever had happened, he'd never been able to use it. Ethan pulled out the envelope. He held it for a moment. He opened it. Man. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, on plain white paper. Ethan read it slowly, going back over sections, reading some of them twice. Victor Langford had written the letter over the course of what appeared to be several days. There were small shifts in the handwriting, places where the pen pressure changed, where the sentences ran differently, and he dated 3 of the sections. The first section was dated about 8 years ago. The last section was dated about 7.5 years ago, 6 months before the car was impounded. Victor had started from the beginning. He and Miles Grayson had met at a commercial real estate conference 12 years ago and had started working together informally, consulting arrangements, deal referrals, before forming their partnership. The partnership had been Victor's money, largely. He'd brought in the capital. Miles had brought in the relationships, the access, the deal flow. That was how Miles had sold it, and Victor had believed it because in the early years it had been true. What Victor hadn't seen, what he'd started to understand about 5 years into the partnership, when he'd hired an outside accounting firm for what he told Miles was a routine audit, was that Miles had been running money out of the partnership through a network of companies that existed on paper in 3 different states. Not enormous amounts at first. Consulting fees paid to entities that Miles controlled. Management fees for services that were never described in detail. Then, as the partnership grew and the transaction volumes got large enough to obscure things, the amounts had grown. By the time Victor understood what was happening, somewhere between $12 and $15 million had moved through those accounts. He'd gone to a lawyer. The lawyer had told him that proving fraud in a business partnership was expensive and difficult, and that the relevant question was documentation. Did Victor have records that would allow a forensic accountant to trace the money? Victor had spent 8 months gathering documents. He'd rebuilt the transaction history himself, pulling bank records, contract copies, correspondence. He'd found the forged signatures, contracts that he had allegedly signed agreeing to payment arrangements he'd never agreed to, documents that had been created to provide paper justification for money movements that were actually theft. He'd also started to understand why Miles had never been worried about being discovered. Miles had spent years cultivating relationships with people who mattered. Regulators, lawyers, city officials, the kind of people who create friction when you try to pursue a complaint against someone they know and like. Victor had filed a complaint with the State Financial Regulatory Authority. It had been reviewed and closed without action. His lawyer had filed a civil suit. It had been moved through the court system slowly, and then a judge had dismissed it on procedural grounds that Victor's lawyer had told him privately were unusual and not entirely explicable. By the time Victor had written the first part of the letter, he'd spent most of his savings on legal fees. He'd sold his stake in 2 commercial properties to raise money. Clara had sold her small consulting business at a loss because they needed the liquidity. By the time he'd written the last section of the letter, he'd been largely out of options. The civil suit was dead. The regulatory complaint had gone nowhere. A second lawyer had reviewed everything and told him that without a federal investigation, without someone with real resources and real authority looking at the paper trail, the evidence he'd gathered was likely to remain exactly what it was, evidence that proved the fraud to anyone who looked at it carefully, but that he couldn't get anyone with the power to act on it to look at. He'd hidden the drive and the letter in the Mustang, his car, the one Miles didn't know about because Victor had bought it separately years before the partnership, kept it in a private storage facility, never mentioned it, because he was afraid. He wrote that plainly, without drama. He was afraid that if he kept the documents somewhere Miles's lawyers could access, they would find a way to make them disappear. The car was the safest place he could think of, title in his name, stored somewhere private, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. He'd meant to retrieve it. He'd had plans to get the documents to a journalist, to a federal investigator he'd been trying to reach, to someone who could use them. But things had moved faster than he'd expected. The storage facility had reported the car to the city for unpaid fees. He'd missed the payments when the money got tight. And by the time he'd understood what had happened, the car had been impounded. The last line of the letter was this: Clara, if you're reading this, a stranger found what I left for you. Trust them enough to at least listen. The evidence is all there. I'm sorry I couldn't finish this myself. Ethan sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. Outside the shop, a truck went past on Carnell Street. Darren was somewhere in the back doing inventory. The fluorescents hummed overhead the way they always did. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then he went to find Clara Langford. He spent 2 days looking before he found her. It wasn't that she was hiding, she just wasn't findable in the obvious ways. Not through social media, which she appeared to have abandoned, not through a listed address. The address from the auction records, the Morrow Hill House, turned out to be a property that had been sold in a foreclosure proceeding 3 years ago. He found that through the county property records, which were public. He found a mention of her in a court document, the dismissal of the civil suit Victor had referenced in the letter, which was a matter of public record. He found a reference to her in the alumni newsletter of a business school she'd apparently attended, a brief mention from 4 years ago. Clara Langford, MBA 98, recently relocated to Eastport. He found, through a business registration database, a small consulting company registered in Eastport under the name Langford Advisory Services, with Clara Langford listed as the sole proprietor. The registration was 3 years old. He got a phone number through the state business registry, a listed contact number for the consulting firm. He sat in his car outside the shop for 10 minutes before he called it. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was professional and neutral, the voice of someone who has learned to keep it that way. Langford Advisory. Ethan had thought about what to say and decided that there was no version of this that wasn't strange, so he might as well be direct. Ms. Langford, my name is Ethan Pierce. I run a car restoration shop in the city. I purchased a 1967 Mustang Fastback at a city impound auction about 2 weeks ago. It was previously registered to a Victor Langford. The silence on the other end was not a short one. I found something inside the car, he said. I think you need to see it. What did you find? Her voice had changed. Not in volume, not in tone exactly, but in something underneath the tone, a quality of attention that hadn't been there before. A letter. And a USB drive. The letter is addressed to you. Another silence. He waited. Where are you located? She asked. Carnell Street, in the Hayden district. I can come to you if that's easier, or I'll come to you, she said. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. What's the address? He gave her the address. She repeated it back to him exactly. Mr. Pierce, she said before hanging up. Is this... She stopped. He heard her take a breath. Did you read it? He considered lying. He decided against it. Yes, he said. I read the letter and I looked at the files on the drive. She was quiet for a moment. Then you know what this is? I think so, yes. Okay, she said. And then, thank you for calling. She hung up. Ethan sat in his car for another few minutes after the call ended, watching the traffic on Carnell Street, thinking about a man he'd never met who had hidden his life's work inside a car and trusted a stranger to find it. He went back inside and got back to work on the Mustang. She arrived at 9:15, which he didn't hold against her. He'd driven to Eastport to meet strangers before, and the traffic on the Cross-City Expressway was unpredictable in the morning. She drove a 4-year-old Honda that had a small dent above the rear wheel arch, the kind of dent that comes from someone in a parking lot who doesn't leave a note. He recognized her before she got out of the car, not because he knew what she looked like, but because of the way she drove into his lot, slowly, taking in the building and the bay doors with the kind of careful attention that people use when they're preparing themselves for something. She sat in the car for about 30 seconds after she parked, not looking at her phone, just sitting. Then she got out. She was in her mid-50s with the kind of posture that comes from decades of professional environments and doesn't entirely leave. She was wearing a jacket over a plain blouse, practical shoes, and she had the look of someone who had slept badly but had done what they could about it. Her hair was dark with some gray coming in at the temples, and she hadn't tried to cover it. Ethan walked out to meet her. He was aware that he had grease on the back of his right hand that he hadn't fully gotten off, and he wiped it on his work pants, which probably didn't help. Ms. Langford, he extended his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm. Mr. Pierce. She was looking at him the way people look at someone they're trying to assess quickly, not rudely, just efficiently. You're younger than I expected. 40, he said. I meant... She paused. I thought you'd be older. Victor always bought cars from older men. She said it with something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the reflex of a smile that stops when it remembers it has nothing to celebrate. This is the shop? Come in, he said. He led her into the main bay. Darren was not there. Ethan had told him to take the morning for a parts run, giving no explanation, and Darren had accepted this with the tolerance of someone who was used to not being given explanations. The bay was quieter than usual without Darren's radio going. The Mustang was there, partially disassembled, the engine out and sitting on its stand, the doors off. Clara Langford stopped when she saw it. For a moment she didn't say anything, she just looked at it. I know it's a mess right now, Ethan said. No. Her voice was quiet. It looked like this when he bought it. He was going to restore it. He bought it the year everything started to go wrong. He said restoring it would be something to work on. She walked toward it slowly and put her hand on the front fender, the bare metal that Ethan had prepped for bodywork. He didn't get far. He had it in a storage facility, Ethan said. It went to impound when the payments lapsed. I know. I tried to get it out. I didn't have the money. She said this without self-pity, which made it harder to hear. I couldn't. The impound fees had compounded, and I had so many other things. She took her hand off the fender. Where did you find the compartment? Ethan showed her. The section of dash structure, the outline of the panel now obvious with the dash removed. She looked at it closely. He built it himself, she said. He was good with his hands. I didn't know. She stopped. He never told me it was in here. I have the letter and the drive at my workbench. Do you want? Yes. He handed her the envelope first. She looked at her name on the front for a moment, turned it over and saw the seal had been broken, and looked at him. I should have told you on the phone, he said. I'm sorry. She shook her head slightly, not dismissive, just moving past it, and sat down on the stool he kept at the workbench. She pulled the letter from the envelope and began to read. Ethan went to the coffee machine and poured himself a cup he didn't particularly want, and stood at the far end of the shop and looked at the other cars he was working on and gave her the time she needed. He heard her turn the pages. He heard the specific silence of someone reading something that is costing them something to read. He did not look over. When she set the letter down, several minutes later, she sat with her hands flat on the workbench and her head bowed slightly, and Ethan waited. She took 2 breaths that he could hear from across the shop. Then she straightened and turned to him. He didn't tell me how scared he was, she said. He told me things were bad. He didn't tell me how afraid he was. Ethan carried his coffee over but didn't sit. He leaned against the workbench on the other side. Did you know about Miles Grayson? About what he'd done? I knew about the lawsuit. I knew Victor believed Miles had stolen from the company. I didn't know. She looked at the USB drive in its bag on the workbench. I didn't know there was documentation. I thought Victor had suspected but couldn't prove it. Every lawyer I talked to after Victor died told me the case was dead, that there was no evidence, that the fraud was too well concealed. She picked up the USB drive. They didn't know about this. No, Ethan said. They didn't. She looked at the drive for a long moment. Then she looked at him. Why did you call me? She asked. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical. She was trying to understand his motive. He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because the letter was addressed to you, he said. Because it was clear it was meant to get to you. Because, he paused. Because I read what he wrote about what happened to you, what you lost. And someone needed to make sure this got to the right person. She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression was not soft. She'd been through too much for softness, and he could see that. But something in it shifted slightly, some tightly held part of it. I've lost everything I can afford to lose, she said. My home. The company I spent 10 years building, 8 years of legal battles that went nowhere. And I've been... She stopped, recalibrated. I've been learning how to survive at a smaller scale than I expected. She set the USB drive down. If these documents can do what Victor believed they could, you need a lawyer who knows financial fraud, Ethan said. A good one, and probably a forensic accountant to go through the spreadsheets. I know. She picked up the letter again and folded it carefully back into the envelope. Victor put this here for me. He knew there was a chance he wouldn't be able to get it out himself, and he trusted that whoever found the car would... She paused. He trusted a stranger. He didn't have many options, Ethan said. No. She looked at him. But you could have done a lot of things with this. Sold it. Ignored it. You could have taken the drive to Miles Grayson's office and sold it to him instead. I didn't know who Miles Grayson was until I read the files. Once you knew, Ethan thought about that. Once I knew, he said, that particular option felt about as appealing as setting the shop on fire. Something in her face relaxed fractionally. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the easing of long-held tension. It was a small thing, and it didn't last, but he noticed it. I'm going to need copies of everything on that drive, she said. I made copies already, he said. 2. One's on a drive in my safe, one's on an encrypted cloud backup. I'll give you the originals and a copy of both. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You made copies. In case something happened to the originals. He said it simply. In case someone found out I had them. She was quiet for a moment. "Victor would have liked you," she said finally. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He went to his safe at the back of the shop and got the drives he'd copied and brought them back and set them on the workbench beside the USB Victor had left. Clara Langford sat at his workbench for another 2 hours that morning, going through the files on her laptop, making notes in a small book she pulled from her bag, occasionally asking him questions about the condition of the car or the compartment that he answered as best he could. She was thorough and she was focused, and she did not cry again, though at one point she stopped reading and sat very still for about 30 seconds before resuming. When she left, she shook his hand again at the door of the shop. "I'll be in touch," she said. "I have a lawyer I trust. We'll start from the beginning." "Okay." She walked to her Honda. She opened the door and then paused and looked back at the shop. At the building, the bay doors, the faded sign over the entrance that said Pierce Restoration in letters that Ethan had been meaning to repaint for 2 years. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "when you're done with the car—" She stopped. "I'll take care of it," he said. She nodded once and got in the car and drove away. He stood in the doorway of his shop and watched her go. Then he went back to the Mustang, picked up his tools, and got back to work. Clara Langford drove back to Eastport in a state that she would have had difficulty naming if someone had asked her to. Not grief. She'd gotten past the acute phase of that years ago, or at least past the phase where it ambushed her at unexpected moments. Not hope exactly, because hope had treated her badly enough over the past several years that she'd learned to approach it the way you approach a dog you don't know, cautiously, from the side, without making sudden moves. What she felt, driving the 2-lane stretch of Route 9 with the USB drive in her jacket pocket and Victor's letter on the passenger seat in its envelope, was something closer to the sensation of having a heavy object returned to you that you'd believed was gone permanently. Not relief. Not joy. Just the strange, slightly destabilizing weight of it back in your hands. She had a lawyer in Eastport, a woman named Patricia Sorrell, who had handled her lease paperwork when she'd set up the consulting firm, and who had, over 3 years of occasional professional contact, turned out to be someone with a mind that moved in straight lines, and a resistance to sentiment that Clara had come to appreciate. Patricia did not practice financial fraud law, but she knew people who did, and she had, twice in their acquaintance, given Clara referrals that turned out to be exactly right. Clara called her from the car, hands-free, somewhere around the Route 9 interchange. "Pat, it's Clara. I need an hour with you this week. Sooner is better." "I have Thursday at 2, Patricia said. She did not ask what it was about, which was one of the reasons Clara trusted her. "I'll be there. And Pat, I need you to recommend someone who handles financial fraud cases, federal level if possible. Someone you'd actually use yourself." A pause. "That's a specific ask." "It's a specific situation." "Thursday at 2, Patricia said. "Bring whatever you have." Clara drove the rest of the way home thinking about Miles Grayson. She had not allowed herself to think about him in any sustained way for about 2 years, not because she'd accepted what had happened, but because sustained thinking about Miles Grayson led to a kind of cold, focused rage that she didn't have a productive outlet for, and rage without an outlet is just poison you carry around. She'd had a therapist for a while who'd talked to her about redirecting that energy, about not letting what Miles had done define her present. Claire had stopped seeing the therapist not because the advice was wrong, but because she could not afford the sessions once her client base contracted. She thought about him now because she had a reason to. The files on the drive were what Victor had assembled, thorough, methodical, the work of a man who had understood that you build a case the way you build anything, one piece at a time, in the right order. But Victor had been working alone, without resources, without the ability to compel anyone to cooperate. The question was whether, 7 years later, those records were still sufficient, whether the accounts still existed, whether the transactions could be traced to current assets. She didn't know. She wasn't a forensic accountant, but she understood enough about how financial fraud cases worked, from the civil litigation she'd been through with Victor's lawyers, from everything she'd read since, to know that the documentation Victor had gathered was not, in itself, a guarantee of anything. It was a foundation. What got built on it depended on who built it and with what tools. She got home at 12:30. She lived in a two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a converted Victorian on Aldrich Street, a building that had been divided into units at some point in the 70s and still showed evidence of that division in its slightly uneven door frames and the particular way the heating system made noise in cold weather. It was a good apartment. She had made it into a good apartment, the way she made most things work through sustained attention. But it was not the house on Morrow Hill, and she had not entirely stopped noticing that. She made tea, sat at her kitchen table, and opened her laptop. She plugged in the copy of the drive and went through the files again, more carefully this time, with the specific purpose of understanding what she was looking at structurally. Not just what the files contained, but how they fit together. The narrative of the fraud that Victor had constructed from the documents. It took her 3 hours. When she was done, she closed the laptop and sat in the kitchen with her cold tea and the particular quiet of a weekday afternoon in an apartment where only one person lives, and she thought about Victor sitting somewhere, at his own desk, in the office he'd had at Morrow Hill, or maybe in that storage facility where he'd kept the Mustang, assembling these documents one by one, going through his own bank records, taking photographs of contracts with his phone, writing notes in the margins of printed pages, building the case that he'd never gotten to use. She thought about Ethan Pierce. She'd assessed him the way she assessed everyone quickly, because it was a habit she'd developed after years in business environments where reading people fast was a practical skill. What she'd concluded about Ethan Pierce in the 2.5 hours she'd spent in his shop was this. He was not a man who talked much when he didn't have something to say. He was not performing helpfulness. He was simply being helpful, which was a different thing and rarer than it should be. He'd made copies of the files before she arrived, not for leverage, but because it had seemed to him like the obvious precaution. He hadn't said anything about it as though it deserved credit. Victor's letter had said, "Trust them enough to at least listen." She thought she could do a little better than that. Back on Carnell Street, Ethan spent the days after Clara's visit doing what he always did when something was bothering him, which was working. The Mustang was in a complicated phase, the phase where you've stripped everything away and what you have left is the raw carcass of a car. And the gap between what it is now and what it's going to be looks enormous, and the only way across is to start. He was working on the body panels. The driver's rear quarter panel needed metal work. The crease he'd identified at the auction, which had turned out to be shallower than it looked, but would still require careful reshaping before filler could go anywhere near it. He was a decent body man, better than average, but not a specialist, and this kind of work required patience more than anything. You worked the metal slowly, feeling for the right tension, the right resistance, letting the metal move the way it wanted to move rather than forcing it. Darren, who had come back from the parts run on the day of Clara's visit, and had absorbed the information that a woman had come to the shop and left with a USB drive by asking 0 questions, eventually broke on the 3rd day. "That woman who came in," he said. He was under the bench car, a 72 Chevelle that belonged to a customer and needed a transmission rebuild, and his voice was slightly muffled. "What was that about?" "I found something in the Mustang," Ethan said. He was working the quarter panel with a slapper and dolly, tapping steadily. "Something that belonged to the previous owner. His wife came and picked it up." "What kind of something?" "Documents." A pause from under the Chevelle. "You're not going to tell me more than that, are you?" "I don't know more than that yet," Ethan said, which was partially true. Darren rolled out from under the car and looked at the quarter panel work. He was quiet for a moment. Darren could assess body work, which was one of his better qualities. "You're going to need to take that down another 3 millimeters before you can feather it properly." "I know." "Just saying." "I know, Darren." Darren rolled back under the Chevelle. On the 5th day after Clara's visit, Ethan got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail and listened to the message while he was washing up at the shop sink. The message was from a man who gave his name as Thomas Brierly, said he represented a client interested in the 1967 Mustang that Ethan had recently purchased from the city impound auction, and asked Ethan to return the call to discuss a potential acquisition. The voice was professional, measured, and entirely without the kind of specificity that would tell you anything about who the client actually was. Ethan stood at the sink with his phone in his hand for a moment. Then he called back. Thomas Brierly picked up on the second ring, The conversation was brief and left Ethan with more questions than answers. Brierly said his client collected classic vehicles and had an interest in acquiring the Mustang for restoration, and that the client was prepared to be, in Brierly's word, generous. When Ethan asked how the client had learned about the car, Brierly said the client kept track of impound auction records as a matter of course. When Ethan asked for the client's name, Brierly said his client preferred to remain anonymous at this stage. At this stage, Ethan repeated. Until we can determine whether a sale is something you'd consider, Brierly said. I'm not selling the car, Ethan said. I think if you heard the figure, I'm not selling the car, Ethan said again. I bought it to restore it. That's what I'm doing. A brief pause. My client is prepared to offer considerably more than restoration value, Mr. Pierce. This isn't a standard offer. I hear you, Ethan said, and the answer is no. Thank you for calling. He hung up and stood for a moment in the middle of the shop floor. Someone knew about the Mustang. Someone had connected the auction records to the car's previous owner quickly enough, within 2 weeks of the auction, to have a lawyer calling with an offer. Anonymous client. Generous offer. Timing that was just a little too specific to be coincidence. He went to his computer and looked up Thomas Brierly. He was a real lawyer, an attorney at a mid-sized firm called Harwick, Brierly and Marsh, with offices downtown. His practice areas were listed as corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, and dispute resolution. His client list was not public. Ethan called Clara. She picked up on the fourth ring, and when he told her about the call, she was quiet for long enough that he checked to make sure the connection hadn't dropped. Miles knows, she said. Maybe. Or someone connected to him. He must have had someone watching the impound records. The car was impounded under Victor's name, Clara said, more to herself than to him. If Miles knew the car existed, and he would have found out eventually, after Victor died, when the lawyers went through everything, he'd have known about the impound. He'd have had someone watching for it. For 7 years? Miles is thorough, she said, and the way she said it had a particular flatness, the flatness of someone describing a quality they've come to understand very well under adverse circumstances. He doesn't leave things open. He doesn't assume something's dealt with just because it looks dealt with. 7 years of having someone check an impound lot record periodically would cost almost nothing for someone with his resources. So when the car sold at auction, he'd have known the next day, maybe the same day. She paused again. Mr. Pierce, I need to ask you something. Ask. Are you still comfortable with your involvement in this? Because it just became more complicated than I think either of us expected when you called me. Ethan looked at the Mustang, stripped to bare metal, the engine sitting on its stand, the doors racked against the wall. A car that was currently worth less than the $1,200 he'd paid for it, in the middle of a process that would take months before it became what it was supposed to be. I copied the files, he said. Somebody needs to know about those copies regardless of what I decide. I have copies. I know. I mean, if something happened to both of us. Another silence. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it since the day I found the compartment, he said. Not in a dramatic way, just practically. Practically, she repeated, and this time there was something warmer in her tone, something that hadn't been there in their first conversation. Thursday, I'm meeting with my lawyer, and she's going to introduce me to a forensic accountant she works with. I'd like you to come, if you're willing. You're the one who found the evidence. You can explain the physical circumstances, how the compartment was constructed, the condition of the materials when you found them. I can do that, he said. 9:30 in the morning in Eastport. I'll text you the address. Okay, he paused. Clara. He caught himself using her first name, which he hadn't before. It's fine, she said, as though she'd noticed and was marking that it was. What? The lawyer who called me, Brierly. He's going to report back to whoever hired him that I said no. What happens after that? She didn't answer immediately, and the pause told him she'd already thought about this. Miles Grayson has spent years making sure certain problems stayed solved, she said. The lawsuit dismissal, the regulatory complaint that went nowhere. None of that happened by accident. He has relationships with people who know how to create friction for other people. Legal friction, mostly. Inspections, complaints, paperwork. She paused. He doesn't usually need to go further than that, because usually that's enough. Usually, Ethan said. Usually, she agreed. No. The meeting on Thursday was in Patricia Sorrell's office on the second floor of a building on Crestwood Avenue in Eastport, a tidy, slightly impersonal space with good bookshelves and the kind of desk that suggested its owner spent real time working at it, rather than using it as a surface for display. Patricia Sorrell was in her late 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and a directness of manner that Ethan respected immediately. She shook his hand when Clara introduced them and gave him a look that was assessing without being unfriendly. Clara told me how you came to have the documents, Patricia said. I want to confirm some of the details for my own records. She asked him questions for about 20 minutes. The auction date, the purchase price, the exact circumstances under which he'd found the compartment, the condition of the materials inside, whether anyone else had handled the envelope or the drive before Clara's visit. She took notes in a legal pad in handwriting that was small and very precise. When he described opening the letter, she made a note without commenting on it, which he appreciated. The forensic accountant was already there when they arrived. A man named Gerald Okafor, 50-ish, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a tablet on the table in front of him that already had several of the files from the drive open on the screen. He'd been reviewing them since the morning, Clara had told Ethan in the elevator. Patricia had sent him the files the night before. I've looked at approximately 2/3 of what's here, Gerald said, without much preamble. He had the manner of someone who's been hired for a specific purpose and finds social niceties to be an inefficient use of a finite resource. I want to be direct about what I'm seeing. Please, Clara said. The documentation is unusual in that it's genuinely comprehensive, Gerald said. He scrolled through something on his tablet. Whoever assembled it, your husband, understood what evidence would be necessary to reconstruct the fraud rather than just indicate it. There's a difference. A lot of fraud documentation shows you that something probably happened. This shows you what happened, when, and through what mechanism. He looked at Clara over his reading glasses. The transaction records trace money movement from the partnership accounts through 4 shell entities to accounts that I can already partially identify as belonging to a holding company associated with Miles Grayson. The room was quiet. I said partially, Gerald continued. There are gaps. Some of the destination accounts will need to be subpoenaed to trace fully. Your husband didn't have access to the receiving end, only the outgoing transactions. But the outgoing records alone are enough to establish a pattern that would be very difficult to explain as anything other than deliberate fraud. How difficult, Patricia said. The kind where the defense attorney's primary strategy becomes arguing about intent rather than the transactions themselves, Gerald said, which is the wrong side of the table to be arguing from. Clara had her hands flat on the conference table. Ethan noticed this because it was the same posture she'd had at his workbench, and he thought it was probably the posture she took when she was holding herself very still so she didn't have to manage whatever was happening internally. The forged signatures, she said. Victor flagged them in the files. I saw that. Gerald nodded. I can't authenticate or reject handwriting. That needs a document examiner. But the contracts in question authorize payment arrangements that are not referenced anywhere in the core partnership agreement. If the signatures are forged, those contracts have no validity. If they're valid, someone would need to explain why Victor Langford agreed in writing to payment structures he apparently didn't know existed. He paused. Neither explanation is good for Miles Grayson. Patricia had been making notes steadily throughout. She looked up. Gerald, what's your timeline for a full analysis? 4 weeks if I'm uninterrupted, 3 if I'm not doing anything else. I need it in 3, Patricia said. She looked at Clara. I want to talk to you about who I think should see this first. There are a couple of options. She glanced at Ethan. I should say, you're not obligated to remain involved beyond what you've already done, Mr. Pierce. Legally, your role here is as the individual who discovered and preserved the evidence. You're not a party to the original fraud or the subsequent legal proceedings. I understand, Ethan said. That said, and I'll be direct, having you available as a witness to the circumstances of the discovery strengthens the evidentiary chain considerably. How the documents were found, by whom, in what condition, is relevant to establishing that they haven't been tampered with. So you're saying I'm useful, Ethan said. Patricia almost smiled. I'm saying your continued involvement is beneficial. Clara was looking at him, not asking. She wasn't the kind of person who asked for things she thought she didn't have the right to ask for. But she was looking at him. I'm not going anywhere, he said. The offer from Thomas Brierly came back 11 days later, doubled. Ethan was in the shop doing primer work on the front fenders when his phone rang with the same number. He put down the spray gun, pulled off his respirator mask, and answered it. Mr. Pierce? Brierly sounded the same as before, polished, impersonal, the voice of someone who delivers messages rather than making decisions. I understand you declined our initial offer. My client has asked me to present a revised figure. Ethan listened to the figure. It was, objectively, a lot of money for a car that was currently in pieces on a shop floor. That's not what this is about, Ethan said. A pause. I'm not sure I follow. The car. Your client doesn't want the car. He wants what he thinks might be in the car. The pause this time was longer. When Brierly spoke again, something in his tone had shifted. It was still professional, but there was a new precision to it, the care of someone who has been reminded that they're in more complicated territory than a simple acquisition. My client is an enthusiast collector who, tell your client the car's been stripped to the frame, Ethan said. There's nothing in it anymore. Whatever he's looking for is not in that shop. He let that sit for a moment. And tell him that if I get another call from you or anyone else about this car, I'm going to have a conversation with a lawyer about what counts as harassment under state business law. He hung up. He stood in the middle of the shop with his respirator hanging around his neck, and he thought about what it meant that Miles Grayson, because he was now fairly certain it was Miles Grayson, regardless of the anonymous framing, had doubled the offer. It meant the first refusal had been reported and assessed. It meant someone had decided that more money was worth trying before moving to whatever came next. And it meant that whatever came next was something they were willing to escalate to, because they hadn't just walked away after the first refusal. He called Clara and told her about the second call. He's starting to understand that the car isn't the problem anymore, Clara said. The problem is what's already out of the car. He doesn't know that for certain. No, but he's starting to calculate for it. She was quiet for a moment. Ethan, Patricia had a meeting this morning. I wasn't going to call you until we knew more, but there's a federal financial crimes investigator she knows, someone who's had Miles Grayson on a list for 3 years without enough to move on. Patricia showed him a summary of what Gerald's found so far. And? He wants to see the full analysis. Gerald's accelerating his timeline. Ethan exhaled slowly. How long before this becomes something that can't be controlled? From Miles's perspective, I think we might already be there, Clara said. He just doesn't know it yet. The suspension on Carnell Street started on a Tuesday. It came as a notice from the city's business licensing division. An inspection had been flagged for Pierce restoration following an anonymous complaint about improper disposal of hazardous materials. The notice was formal, bureaucratically impeccable in its language, and set an inspection date 2 weeks out. Ethan read it twice, standing in the shop office, and felt a specific kind of cold settle in him that wasn't quite anger. He called his business attorney, a man named Stuart Keel, who handled his contracts and the shop lease, and read him the notice over the phone. Improper disposal, Stuart said. What's your current disposal setup? Same as it's been for 11 years, registered waste contractor, documented pickups, everything filed. Then you're fine. I know I'm fine, that's not the point. Stuart was quiet for a moment. No, you're right, it's not. He paused. Who did you annoy? Ethan told him. Not everything, just enough. A car he'd bought at auction, the previous owner, someone with resources who wanted the car back and had been told no twice. Okay, Stuart said, and his voice had changed slightly, gotten more careful. I'm going to pull your disposal records, and we're going to have everything documented and organized before that inspection date. You're going to sail through it. I know. And then whatever complaint got filed is going to look exactly like what it is. Yes, but there'll be another one after this one. Probably, Stuart said. How serious is the person you annoyed? Serious enough to have been doing this to people for years, Ethan said. Stuart made a sound that was not quite a sigh. All right, keep me copied on anything that comes in. Any letter, any notice, any communication that feels off. Darren found out about the inspection notice the way Darren found out about most things. He came across the paperwork on the office desk, read it, and appeared in the shop bay with the expression of someone who has questions and is going to ask them whether the timing is convenient or not. Anonymous complaint, Darren said. That's what the notice says. About hazardous waste disposal. Our waste disposal, which is fine. Correct. Darren crossed his arms. He was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Ethan looked up from what he was working on. This is about the Mustang, Darren said. The letter thing, whatever that was. Ethan didn't confirm or deny it immediately. He looked at Darren, 24 years old, good with his hands, mouthy in a way that was mostly harmless, and someone who had been working in the shop long enough that he wasn't just an employee in a transactional sense. Yeah, Ethan said. I think so. So somebody's messing with the shop now. Starting to. Are we in actual trouble? He asked it with a directness that Ethan appreciated. No drama, just a practical question. Not legally. The inspection will be fine. He paused. But there may be more of it. Darren thought about this for a moment. Okay, he said, and went back to what he was doing. That was it. Just, okay. Ethan recognized it for what it was and didn't say anything about it, because saying something about it would have made it into something Darren would feel uncomfortable about, and it was better left as what it was, the simple, undemonstrative decision of someone who wasn't going anywhere. The break-in happened on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the first inspection notice. Ethan got the call at 6 in the morning from his alarm company. A motion sensor had triggered in the shop at 2:47 a.m. He drove to Carnell Street and found the rear door, the one that opened onto the alley behind the shop, had been forced. The lock had been punched through. Not a sophisticated entry, the work of someone who wanted in quickly and wasn't worried about leaving traces. He stood in the alley for a moment and looked at the door, then went inside. The shop had been searched, not ransacked. That was the specific detail that sat with him. A ransack is rage or desperation. What he found inside was different. Drawers opened and left open, cabinet doors ajar, the area around his workbench disturbed but not destroyed. Someone had been looking for something specific, working systematically, and had not found it. Because whatever they'd been looking for, the USB drive and its copies were not in the shop. The original was with Clara. His copy was in a safe deposit box at a credit union on Farlow Street that he'd opened the week after Clara's visit, specifically for this purpose. He called the police and filed a report. He called Stuart. He called Clara. He's moving faster than I expected, Clara said. She sounded like she'd been awake. Does that tell you something? It tells me Gerald's timeline is relevant. If Miles is escalating this quickly after 2 phone calls and an inspection complaint, she stopped. Patricia spoke to the federal investigator again yesterday. He's moving this up his chain. I don't know exactly what that means in terms of timeline, but things are starting to happen that are outside of Miles's control, and he may be sensing that. How? People talk. He has contacts everywhere. If someone at the federal level is asking questions about accounts associated with his companies, word moves. She paused. Ethan, I need you to listen to me carefully. I don't want this to cost you your business. I didn't come to you for this. You came to me, and there's a difference. I know the difference. I mean, Clara. He said it quietly but clearly. I know what I signed up for when I called you. I'm not walking this back. A long pause on the line. Outside the shop, the early morning traffic on Carnell Street was beginning. Delivery trucks, commuters, the ordinary machinery of a city waking up. The rear door was standing open to the alley, and the morning air was coming in, carrying the smell of dumpsters and exhaust, and somebody's coffee from somewhere down the block. The files are safe, she said finally. Both copies? Both copies, and Gerald has his working set secured separately. Patricia made sure of that. She paused. There's something else I need to tell you. Patricia heard from the investigator this morning before you called. He has a contact, a journalist at the Meridian Journal who's been looking into Grayson Capital for about a year on a separate matter, financial reporting discrepancies. Patricia thinks we should coordinate. A journalist. It changes the dynamic. Once a credible news organization has the documentation, it's no longer just a legal proceeding that can be slowed down or buried. It's a story. Her voice had a careful, controlled quality that he recognized as the sound of someone managing a feeling that is too large to let run free. Victor always believed that the only way to actually stop Miles was to make it public. The law wasn't enough because Miles could manage the law, but you can't manage a story once it's out. Ethan looked around the shop, at the disturbed drawers, the forced door, the Mustang sitting in pieces in the main bay, its bare metal catching the early light coming through the high windows. A car that someone had loved, that someone had hidden their greatest act of honesty inside, that had sat in an impound lot for 7 years waiting for a stranger to find it. Then we make it public, he said. There's risk in moving that fast. There's risk in moving slow too, he said. We found that out last night. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Patricia will set up the meeting with the journalist. I'll let you know when. Okay. He looked at the broken rear door and thought about what it would cost to replace the lock and reinforce the frame, and what it would cost if someone came back when someone was in the building. Clara, one more thing. Yes? Make sure the journalist knows about the compartment, about how the documents were found. That part matters. Why? He thought about how to say it. Because a man built that compartment with his own hands and put his life's work inside it and trusted a stranger to find it and do the right thing. That's not a footnote. That's the whole story. She was quiet long enough that he thought he might have overstepped. Then she said quietly, Yes, it is. She hung up. Ethan stood in his shop with his phone in his hand and the morning coming in through the broken door, and he thought about Miles Grayson, who had spent years building something on a foundation of other people's stolen lives, and who had just made the mistake of trying to take something from a man who had almost nothing to lose and knew it. He got his tools and started blocking the door. The journalist's name was Nora Vasquez, and she had been at the Meridian Journal for 9 years, which was long enough to have developed the specific patience of someone who has learned that good stories don't arrive complete. They arrive in pieces, and the work is in figuring out how the pieces connect. Patricia Sorrell had arranged the meeting for a Saturday morning at a coffee shop in a neighborhood that was equidistant between Eastport and the city, a place called Grounds on Mellick Street that was busy enough to be anonymous and small enough that you could hold a conversation without raising your voice. Clara arrived first, then Ethan 5 minutes later, then Patricia, and Nora Vasquez came in last, carrying a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and a coffee she'd bought somewhere else, which Ethan clocked as the habit of someone who'd learned not to spend money on things she could bring herself. She was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back practically, and the kind of face that was better suited to listening than to performing attention. There was no performance in it, just a steady, undemonstrative focus that reminded Ethan somewhat of the way Gerald Okafor had looked at the files in Patricia's conference room. She sat down across from Clara and looked at her for a moment before saying anything. You're Victor Langford's wife, she said. Widow, Clara said. Not with bitterness, just precision. I've been looking into Grayson Capital for about 14 months, Nora said. The angle I had was financial reporting irregularities in 2 of their subsidiary funds. Standard stuff, or so I thought. The kind of discrepancy that could be sloppy accounting or could be something worse. I couldn't get past the surface because I didn't have access to the internal transaction records. She paused. Patricia told me what you have. She told you what we have, Clara said. Some of it. She was appropriately careful. Nora looked at Ethan. And you're the mechanic who found the compartment. That's right. Can you describe it to me? Exactly as it was. He did. The same way he'd described it to Patricia, methodically, without embellishment. The panel, the screws, the bubble wrap, the envelope, and the drive. Nora listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked 3 follow-up questions that told him she'd understood immediately which details were evidentiary and which were narrative. She was good at her job, he thought. You could tell by which questions she didn't ask. The federal investigation, she said, looking at Patricia. Where does that stand? An investigator at the Financial Crimes Unit has reviewed Gerald Okafor's preliminary analysis and escalated internally, Patricia said. I don't have timeline information. These things move slowly, and I'm not being kept in the loop on specifics. That's appropriate. But it's moving. It's moving. Nora wrapped both hands around her borrowed coffee cup and thought for a moment. She had a legal pad in front of her and had written almost nothing on it, which Ethan found interesting. Some journalists wrote constantly during conversations, using the pen as a way of managing the silence. She didn't seem to need that. Here's what I want to be honest about, she said. She was looking at Clara. Publishing a story like this, with the documentation you have, given the federal interest, is almost certainly going to accelerate whatever Miles Grayson is doing to protect himself. Right now he's operating under the assumption that he can still manage this. Once the story runs, that assumption is gone. Things will happen faster, and they will be less predictable. I know, Clara said. I want to make sure you know, because you've been through a lot, and I don't want to— Miss Vasquez. Clara's voice was quiet and clear. I lost my husband, my home, and 8 years of my life to what Miles Grayson did. I understand that publishing this story creates risk. I also understand that not publishing it leaves him exactly where he's been, managing, controlling, waiting for the problem to go away. She paused. My husband hid this evidence because he ran out of legal options. I'm not going to waste it by being cautious about the wrong things. Nora held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. I'll need access to the full documentation, Gerald Okafor's analysis, and I'll need both of you, she looked between Clara and Ethan, available for on-record conversations. When are you thinking? Patricia asked. I need 3 weeks minimum to verify independently. There are sources I want to talk to before I run anything, people inside Grayson Capital, or formerly inside. And I'll need the document examiner's report on the signatures before I can make the forgery claim. She looked at Ethan. The compartment. The car itself. Can I see it? Whenever you want, he said. She looked at Clara. And the letter. Victor's letter. Are you comfortable with me reading it? Clara was quiet for a moment. It was a real moment, not a performative one. Yes, she said. Victor wrote it to be used. That's why he wrote it. Nora came to Carnell Street the following Wednesday afternoon. She spent 2 hours in the shop, going over the compartment area in detail, photographing it, measuring it, asking Ethan questions about the construction and what it told him about when and how it had been built. She handled the original USB drive in its bag and the envelope with the kind of careful attention you give to things you understand to be important. She read Victor's letter standing at the workbench, and when she finished, she stood there for a moment without saying anything, the pages held loosely in her hand. He was a thorough man, she said finally. From what I can tell, Ethan said, the letter is remarkable, not because of what it contains, though that's significant, but because of how he wrote it. She set the pages down carefully. He wrote it knowing he might never be able to deliver it himself. He wrote it for a stranger. She looked at Ethan. He was writing it for you, in a sense. Someone he'd never met. Yeah, Ethan said. I've thought about that. She took photographs of the compartment from 3 different angles, photographed the letter pages, and photographed the exterior of the envelope with Clara's name on the front. She asked about the 4 screws, whether he'd kept them. He had. They were in a small labeled bag on his parts shelf, which she photographed too. She was thorough in a way that was not fussy but purposeful, and when she left, she shook his hand and said she'd be in touch. Darren appeared from the back of the shop approximately 30 seconds after Nora's car left the lot. That was a journalist, he said. Yes. From the Meridian Journal. I saw her bag. She had a press credential clipped to the strap. Ethan looked at him. You're very observant. I observe things, Darren said. He crossed his arms and leaned against the workbench. Whatever you found in this car, it's big, isn't it? It might be. Darren was quiet for a moment. The Mustang sat between them in the bay, more complete than it had been, the body panels back on and the primer coat done, the engine block cleaned up and beginning to look like something that could run again. It was still months from finished, but it was taking shape in the way that a car takes shape partway through a restoration, You could see what it was going to be. The inspection passed, Darren said. The one from the city. Everything was fine. I know, Stuart handled it. But there was another notice this morning. Environmental code compliance, building permits. Darren said it carefully, watching Ethan's face. I put it on your desk. Ethan hadn't checked his desk since the morning. He went to the office, found the notice, and read it. It was different from the first one. This one flagged two separate potential violations, both vague in their language, the kind of vagueness that suggests the point is the inspection itself rather than any specific compliance issue. A second inspection scheduled for 3 weeks out. He called Stuart. It's a pressure campaign, Stuart said, without Ethan having to explain. Standard playbook when you can't get what you want through direct means. Make the target's life administratively difficult. Inspections, complaints, permit reviews, none of them individually are serious, but they add up in time, cost, and stress. What do I do? Same as before. We document everything, we comply perfectly, we keep records of every notice and every response. A pause. And Ethan, I need to know how long this is going to go on. I don't know exactly. Ballpark. Weeks, maybe a month or two. He thought about what Patricia had said about the federal investigation. After that, the pressure probably moves somewhere else. Probably, Stuart repeated in the tone of a man who does not find that word reassuring. I know, I'm sorry you're in the middle of this. I'm not in the middle of it, Stuart said. You're in the middle of it. I'm adjacent. There's a difference. A pause. Just keep me in the loop, every piece of paper that comes in. Miles Grayson was not a man who made appearances in places where he might be seen doing something he'd rather not be seen doing. This was a principle he'd applied consistently for most of his adult life, and it had served him well. What he did instead was manage through layers, lawyers, intermediaries, people whose loyalty had been purchased at a price that reflected their usefulness. He did not call Ethan Pierce. He did not send anyone to Ethan Pierce's shop in a way that could be connected directly to him. What he did was apply pressure from a distance, through mechanisms that looked, on the surface, like routine administrative processes. The problem with pressure applied from a distance, through mechanisms you can't fully control, is that you can't always see what it's doing. Miles Grayson knew, through Brierly, that the two offers had been declined. He knew, through someone else, that the inspection complaint had not produced the disruption he'd hoped for. He knew that the car had been stripped to the frame, which meant if there had been anything inside it, it was gone now, already wherever it was going to be. He was operating, at this point, on the assumption that something had been found, that someone had it, and that the question was what they were going to do with it and whether he could still affect the outcome. He did not know about Gerald Okafor or the federal investigator. He did not know about Patricia Sorrell's conversations with the Financial Crimes Unit. He did not know about Nora Vasquez or the Meridian Journal. What he knew was that he was uncomfortable, and Miles Grayson had not been uncomfortable in a sustained way for quite some time, and it was making him do things slightly faster and slightly less carefully than he would have done them otherwise. Ethan didn't know any of this. He was reconstructing a 1967 Mustang and trying to keep his shop's administrative paperwork in order and communicating with Clara every few days. And what he knew about Miles Grayson's internal state, he inferred from the pattern of what was coming at him. The escalation from a call to a doubled offer to an inspection complaint to a break-in to two simultaneous compliance notices. That pattern told him something. A man who is confident doesn't escalate that way. A man who is confident either stops pushing or keeps pushing at the same level. Escalation suggested that the thing being protected was more important than the cost of the protection, and that the cost was starting to feel like it might not be working. He shared this inference with Clara in a phone call that happened on a Tuesday evening, with the shop closed and Ethan sitting in his car in the parking lot behind the building because the shop itself had started to feel like a place that might be observed, which was not a rational concern necessarily, but also not entirely irrational. You're reading him right, Clara said. Miles only escalates when he's scared. He's managed things so smoothly for so long that he thinks of himself as someone who doesn't need to be afraid. When he starts doing things sloppily, the break-in was sloppy, the double notice is sloppy, it means the fear is running ahead of the strategy. Is that good or bad for us? It depends on whether he has a final option he hasn't used yet. She paused. I've been thinking about that. What he has available beyond what he's already tried. And? He's going to try to discredit the evidence, she said. He can't make it disappear anymore, but he knows that, or he should. So the next move is to make it inadmissible, or unreliable, or tainted. Argue it was fabricated. Argue the chain of custody is broken. Argue that Victor assembled it selectively. She paused again. That's why your role matters, Ethan. The compartment, the condition of the materials, the unbroken sequence from your discovery to my custody to Patricia's files. That chain has to be clean. It is clean. I know, but he's going to try to find a crack in it. He thought about that. The sequence was straightforward. He'd found it, photographed it before he touched it, documented everything, called her. But documentation could be questioned. Sequences could be challenged. A good lawyer could construct a narrative about a mechanic who found a car, discovered documents that were valuable, and had reason to manipulate their provenance. He'd need to know who I am, Ethan said, to build a case against me. He already knows who you are, Clara said quietly. He knew before Brierly made the first call. That sat with Ethan for a moment in the parking lot. The evening was cooling off, and across the lot a restaurant's back-of-house door was open, and he could smell whatever they were cooking. Something with garlic, something good. Ordinary life carrying on at its ordinary pace, completely indifferent to whatever was happening in his parking lot and Clara's kitchen and Miles Grayson's management of his fear. Nora's making progress, Clara said. She called Patricia yesterday. She found a former employee of Grayson Capital, someone who left 4 years ago under circumstances that Nora described as suggestive. She's not ready to talk on record yet, but she's talking. That changes things. It might. External corroboration, Shira. Someone who was inside and saw things. That's different from transaction records. That's a person. She paused. Victor never had a person. Everyone who knew anything was either still employed or too afraid. Why is this woman talking now? 4 years out, new career, different city, Clara said. And apparently she's been following Nora's earlier financial reporting on Grayson Capital and knew things were getting close. Sometimes people wait until they can see which way it's going before they decide to get on the right side. That's convenient. It's human, Clara said, without judgment. Not everyone can afford to be brave early. The third inspection notice arrived on a Friday, and this one was different in tone. The previous two had been bureaucratically neutral, the language of official process. This one cited a specific complaint filed by a named business, a company called Harwick Property Management, alleging that waste materials from Pierce Restoration had contaminated a drainage easement adjacent to the property. The notice had the weight of something that had been carefully prepared rather than hastily generated. Ethan called Stewart before he'd finished reading it. Harwick Property Management, Stewart said, after Ethan read him the relevant section. He was quiet for a moment. Can you give me 20 minutes? Stewart called back in 15. Harwick Property Management is a shell company, he said, registered 18 months ago in a state that has minimal disclosure requirements. I can't trace the owner through public records. You're not surprised? No, this is different from the first two. This one is designed to look like a third-party complaint, which gives it more weight administratively. The drainage contamination allegation is specific enough to require a response. He paused. I need you to come in Monday morning, and we're going to go through the environmental records for the last 3 years. Everything. This is going to take real work to respond to, and we need to get ahead of it. Ethan put the notice on his desk and sat looking at it. The shop was quiet. It was past 6 on a Friday. Darren had gone home. The last customer car had been picked up at 4. The Mustang sat in the main bay. The engine mounts back in and the engine dropped in. Connected but not yet running. The kind of state where it looked almost finished but wasn't close. There were still hundreds of hours between where it was and where it was going to be. He'd been thinking about timelines. Gerald's report was supposed to be done in 3 weeks. Nora had said 3 weeks minimum when they'd met at the coffee shop, and that had been 10 days ago, which meant she was probably still in the middle of her verification process. The federal investigation was moving at whatever pace federal investigations moved, which was not a pace that corresponded to anything happening in Ethan's parking lot or his inspection notices. He called Clara and told her about the third notice. The drainage complaint, she said. That's a different kind of pressure. The first two were nuisances. This one is meant to cost you money, legal fees, environmental testing, response documentation. I know. Ethan, she stopped. He could hear her deciding something. Gerald finished early. His report is done. He straightened. How early? He finished Thursday. He didn't tell Patricia until Friday morning because he wanted to go back through one section again. Patricia called me an hour ago. A pause. It's thorough. $14,200,000, traced across 9 transactions over 6 years, routed through 4 shell entities to accounts that Gerald can link to a holding company registered in Miles Grayson's wife's name. Ethan was quiet. The forged signatures say Gerald flagged 6 contracts, not 2. Victor only found 2, but there were 6. Gerald found the others by comparing document metadata in the PDFs, which showed creation dates that didn't match the signing dates. A pause. Patricia is submitting the full report to the federal investigator Monday morning. Ethan let that settle. Outside the shop, a car went past on Carnell Street. A late-model sedan going faster than the speed limit, then brake lights at the corner, then gone. Ordinary Friday night traffic. Nothing significant. That's why the notices are coming faster, he said. Someone told him something's moving. Maybe. Or he's just accelerating because he hasn't been able to stop it with what he's already tried. Claire's voice had that careful quality again. Either way, Patricia thinks we need to move on the journalist piece. Not wait for the federal investigation to announce itself. Do the story first. Nora said 3 weeks. Patricia is going to call her Monday and push. Not to rush the verification. Nora won't cut corners on that, and she shouldn't. But to accelerate whatever can be accelerated. A pause. There's something else. Tell me. The former Grayson Capital employee agreed to go on record this morning. She called Nora at 8 a.m. and said yes. Clara paused. Her name is Diane Cho. She was Grayson Capital's internal compliance officer for 3 years, starting 8 years ago. She left 4 years ago. She knows about the accounts, not all of them, but enough. She was asked to sign off on filings that she flagged internally and was told to approve anyway. When she pushed back, she was pushed out. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. A compliance officer, someone whose literal job had been to catch exactly what Miles had been doing, who had caught it and been removed for it. She's been living with this for 4 years, he said. Yes. And she's talking now because she can see it's going somewhere. She told Nora she'd been waiting for someone to have enough to make it matter, Clara said. Her word was enough. She didn't want to come forward to nothing. She'd seen what happened to Victor when he tried without enough. There was a weight in that. Ethan sat with it for a moment. A woman who had watched from the outside, carrying what she knew, waiting for the accumulation to reach a threshold. People surviving the way they can, with what they have. Nora's going to have everything she needs, he said. Yes, Claire said. I think so. He called Patricia himself the following Monday, which was not something he'd planned to do. It was an impulse, or close to one, and he followed it because he'd learned to trust the specific kind of impulse that comes from a clear sense of what needs to happen rather than from anxiety. Patricia picked up on the second ring. Mr. Pierce? I want to make sure the copies are distributed before the story runs, he said. All of them. I want the federal investigator to have everything. I want Nora to have everything. I want Clara's copies secured in multiple locations, and I want a set with a third party, someone outside of all of us. He paused. Is there a mechanism for that? A law firm? A document repository? Something that exists specifically for this kind of thing? Patricia was quiet for a moment. There are document escrow services that handle sensitive legal materials, she said. I've used them. It's not complicated. I want to do that before the story runs. May I ask why the urgency? Because right now Miles Grayson thinks there's still something to recover or destroy, Ethan said. Once the story runs, he loses that belief and starts focusing on defending himself. The transition between those two states is when things get unpredictable. I want everything secured before we hit that window. A pause. That's sound thinking, Patricia said, and he could hear the mild surprise in her voice, the slight recalibration. I'll set it up. I'll need a day. Take 2, he said. Do it right. He hung up and went back to the Mustang. The engine was in and connected. He'd rebuilt the carburetor 2 days before. It had needed more work than expected. The accelerator pump deteriorated and one of the fuel inlet needles pitted badly enough to require replacement. He'd sourced the parts through a specialty supplier he'd used before, a place in Ohio that stocked period-correct components for Ford's FE big block engines and had never let him down. He was working on the fuel system now. The fuel tank had been cleaned and sealed, the lines replaced throughout, the pump rebuilt. He was tracing the lines from the tank forward, checking every connection, making sure nothing had been missed. It was methodical work, the kind that required attention without demanding creativity, and it let his mind work on other things at the same time. He was thinking about Miles Grayson in the specific way he'd been trained, without really meaning to be trained, by 11 years of looking at cars that had been damaged or neglected. When a car comes to you damaged, the first question isn't what's broken. The first question is why it broke. What underlying condition, what history of decisions allowed the break to happen? You can fix the break and miss the underlying condition entirely, and then it breaks again, somewhere else, in a way you didn't anticipate. Miles Grayson had been operating under a condition, the belief that he was smart enough and connected enough and resourceful enough that no combination of circumstances could put him in a position he couldn't manage. Victor had threatened that belief, and Miles had managed the threat. Through the courts, through the regulators, through the slow erosion of Victor's resources, until the lawsuit died and Victor died and the threat seemed to go away. And then a car sold at a city impound auction to a mechanic on Carnell Street, and the condition was back and Miles had tried to manage it, the same way he'd managed everything else. The problem was the condition had changed. Victor had been alone. Clara had been broke and exhausted. There had been no journalist, no forensic accountant, no federal investigator, no compliance officer waiting to go on record. Miles had been managing a threat that existed in a specific, limited configuration, and the configuration had changed without his being able to see it changing. That was the thing about pressure campaigns, Ethan thought. They work as long as the person being pressured doesn't have more to lose by stopping than by continuing. He had very little to lose by continuing. A shop that was already being targeted, a car he'd bought for $1,200 that he was rebuilding because that was what he did. No family in the immediate vicinity who could be used as leverage. No reputation beyond Carnell Street that could be threatened. He wasn't brave. He just didn't have the right vulnerabilities. He torqued the last fuel line fitting and checked it twice and moved on to the next one. Nora called him on a Thursday evening, 11 days after their meeting at the coffee shop, which was faster than 3 weeks but slower than urgency. "I need to ask you something directly," she said. There was background noise behind her. A newsroom, he thought, the specific ambient sound of a place where a lot of people are working at the same time. "Off the record for now." "Okay." Someone reached out to the Journal today. Not to me directly. To the editor. Anonymous tip, through a secure channel, claiming that the documentation you found was fabricated, that Victor Langford was engaged in financial fraud himself, and that you've been recruited by Clara Langford to construct a false narrative that implicates Miles Grayson. She paused. "The editor told me about it because it's my story, and I needed to know." Ethan was sitting on the stool at his workbench. He set down the wrench he'd been holding. "When did this come in?" "About 3 this afternoon." "Has anything else come in? Other outlets?" "I don't know. I've been making calls." He thought about it. Someone had figured out that Nora was working the story, or had guessed, based on the Journal's earlier coverage of Grayson Capital, and had made a preemptive move. Not a legal move, not an inspection notice, but an attempt to poison the well at the source. "What does your editor think?" he asked. "My editor thinks that an anonymous tip discrediting a story that hasn't been published yet tells him more about the tip's source than about the story," Nora said. "He's not pulling back, but he needs to be sure." A pause. "I verified most of the financial documentation independently. Gerald's methodology is sound. Diane Cho's account is corroborated by the documents in ways she couldn't have known about if she'd fabricated her account." Another pause. "But I need one more thing." "What?" "The document examiner's report, on the forged signatures. Patricia said she was commissioning one. Do you know where that stands?" Ethan called Patricia from the shop. Patricia called the document examiner. The examiner, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Park, who taught forensic document analysis at the State University and worked consulting cases as a sideline, had been working through the 6 contracts Gerald had flagged. She wasn't done, but she had preliminary findings on 3 of them, and Patricia relayed what Dr. Park had told her. All 3 showed handwriting inconsistencies inconsistent with natural variation in an individual's signature across time. In plain terms, they were not signed by Victor Langford. Ethan called Nora back and told her. "Preliminary," he said, "not final." "Preliminary is enough to keep going," Nora said. "Final is what we need before we publish." "How long for final?" Dr. Park told Patricia another 10 days. A pause. "I can be ready to publish in 10 days. "Then we have 10 days, Ethan said. He hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the shop. The Mustang was taking shape in the main bay. Engine in, fuel system done, the exterior panels primed and blocked, ready for paint. A couple of months of work left, maybe less if he pushed. It was starting to look like what it was, a 1967 Mustang Fastback, a car that had been made correctly once and had been allowed to deteriorate and was being made correctly again. He thought about Miles Grayson getting a call from whoever he'd sent the anonymous tip through, being told the journal hadn't folded, that the story was still moving. He thought about what Miles would do next, in the 10 days before the story ran. He went back to the workbench and wrote a message to Patricia, Clara, and Nora in a group text that Patricia had set up for exactly this kind of coordination. 10-day window before publication. Assume escalation. Make sure everything is where it needs to be. Patricia responded in 2 minutes. Document escrow is set up. Copies distributed as of this morning. Clara responded 4 minutes after that. Understood. Nora didn't respond to the group text, which was appropriate. She operated on different protocols. But she'd already been moving when she called, and she would keep moving because that was what she did. The 10 days were going to be the hardest part, not because anything that came at them in that window could stop what was already in motion. He believed that, or close to it. But because 10 days is long enough for someone who is scared and losing control to do something that isn't part of the calculated pressure campaign. Something less managed, less careful, driven more by fear than by strategy. He didn't say this to Clara. She knew it already. He locked up the shop, set the alarm on the new system he'd had installed after the break-in, a better system with external cameras covering the rear alley and the parking lot, and drove home through the city's ordinary Thursday evening, through traffic and stoplights and the entirely indifferent machinery of 10,000 people going about their lives. The Mustang would need 2 coats of primer surfacer before color. He was thinking about that too, in the back of his mind. The color. The original color had been Highland green, and there was enough of the original paint visible under the faded surface that he could match it. He was going to match it. That was always the plan. You don't restore something by making it into something different. You restore it by finding out what it was supposed to be and working until it gets there. He drove home in the dark, thinking about paint and 10 days and what was already in motion and what couldn't be stopped now, regardless of what Miles Grayson did next. The 10 days did not pass quietly. On the 3rd day, Stewart called to say that a second anonymous complaint had been filed, this one with the State Contractor Licensing Board, alleging that Pierce Restoration had performed work on vehicles without the required documentation for certain emission-related repairs. The allegation was specific enough to suggest someone had done research on what kind of complaint would require the most response effort, and vague enough that it couldn't be easily dismissed without a full audit of Ethan's records going back 2 years. Ethan sat in the shop office with the phone pressed to his ear and said nothing for a moment. "I know," Stewart said. "How much is this going to cost me?" "In time, a lot. In money, I'm going to do what I can to contain it. But the licensing board complaint requires a formal response within 30 days and an internal records review." A pause. "Ethan, I have to be honest with you. If these keep coming, a new complaint every week or two, eventually one of them is going to land somewhere that creates real operational disruption, not because you've done anything wrong, just from the volume." "How many more do you think there are?" "I don't know. Whoever is filing them has resources and patience. They're not going to run out of regulatory bodies to file with." Stewart's voice was careful. How close are we to the thing that ends this? A week, maybe less. A long pause. Okay, I can hold the line for a week. Ethan hung up and looked through the office window at the Mustang in the main bay. The color coat had gone on 2 days ago. 3 applications of Highland green, color matched to the original paint under a section of the roof where the clear coat had preserved it. A spot the size of a playing card that had been waiting under all that faded oxidation to show exactly what the car had been. The color was correct. Standing in the bay looking at it, you could see what it had been in 1967. Not just a car, but a particular kind of intention made physical. The belief of the people who built it that form and function could add up to something more than the sum of their parts. Darren had gone quiet about the complaints. He knew about them. Ethan hadn't hidden it, and he'd absorbed the information the same way he'd absorbed everything else, without drama, with the specific practical focus of someone who has decided where he stands and is getting on with things. He'd stayed late twice in the past week without being asked, catching up on shop documentation, organizing the disposal records Stewart needed for the licensing board response, pulling customer invoices for the emission work audit. He hadn't mentioned it. Ethan hadn't either. Some forms of loyalty don't require acknowledgement to be real. Clara heard about the licensing board complaint from Ethan and made a call to Patricia, and Patricia made a call to the federal investigator, a man named Special Agent David Rourke, who had been assigned to the escalated case from the Financial Crimes Unit. The call was not long, but its substance was significant. Patricia told Rourke about the pattern of complaints against Pierce Restoration. The inspection notices, the break-in, the drainage allegation, now the licensing board, and asked whether the timing, in the context of the investigation, was something his unit should be aware of. Rourke said it was. Clara told Ethan about this conversation the following evening, and Ethan asked what it meant practically. It means they're watching how Miles responds to the pressure on his end, Clara said. It establishes a pattern of behavior. What he's doing to you isn't just harassment, it's evidence of consciousness of guilt. Someone who wasn't worried about what's in those files doesn't hire lawyers to make anonymous complaints about a mechanic's drainage easement. Consciousness of guilt, Ethan said. That's a legal term. Patricia's term, not mine, but yes. A pause. It also means that if he does anything more serious, anything beyond administrative complaints, Rourke's unit has context for it. More serious, Ethan said. Like what? I don't know. I hope we don't find out. Her voice was steady, but he'd learned to hear the calibration in it, the effort it took to keep it that way. Nora called me this morning. Dr. Park finished the document examination. He straightened. All 6? All 6. Consistent findings across all of them. The signatures on the payment authorization contracts are not Victor's. She found evidence of tracing in 2 of them, which means whoever forged them had access to Victor's genuine signature on another document and reproduced it by tracing over it. That's not just forgery, Patricia says. That's premeditation. It means someone planned this, had access to legitimate documents, and took deliberate steps. The word premeditation sat in the air between them for a moment, across whatever distance lay between his parking lot and her kitchen. Nora's ready, Clara said. She told Patricia the story is complete. She has the financial documentation, Gerald's analysis, Diane Cho on record, Dr. Park's findings, my account, your account of finding the compartment. She has the pattern of Grayson Capital's shell company registrations traced across 3 states. A pause. She's going to her editor tomorrow for final approval. If he approves, and she thinks he will, publication is 4 days from now. 4 days. Saturday morning. The journal runs its major investigative pieces on Saturdays because that's when readership is highest for long-form content. She paused. There's one more thing. Patricia submitted Gerald's full report to Rourke's unit this morning, along with Dr. Park's findings. Rourke called Patricia this afternoon and told her, and he was careful about what he said, Patricia told me he was very careful, that the submission had been reviewed by his supervisors and that there was sufficient basis to move forward with formal proceedings. Ethan was quiet. He didn't say what that means in terms of timing, Clara said. These things don't move on a schedule you can predict. But he used the phrase move forward, which is different from what he'd been saying before, which was variations on we're reviewing. 4 days until the story runs, Ethan said, and something moving at the federal level. Yes. Miles doesn't know about either of those things. No. A pause. But he's going to. On the 6th day of the 10-day window, Ethan came to the shop at 7 in the morning and found a car parked across the entrance to his lot. Not blocking it entirely, positioned in a way that was ambiguous, a dark blue sedan that could have belonged to someone visiting the building next door, or a resident who'd parked carelessly, or someone who was very deliberately putting a car where it would be noticed. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment, then went in the back way. He called Patricia, described the car, gave her the plate number he'd photographed with his phone. She called back in 40 minutes. The car was registered to a company called Strand Consulting Group, which was registered in the same state as Harwick Property Management, with similarly minimal public disclosure. She couldn't trace the ownership. Move your own car to the back lot, Patricia said. Don't engage with whoever is in that vehicle. Don't approach the car. No one was in it when I arrived. That's fine. Just leave it alone. A pause. I'm calling Rourke. The blue sedan was gone by noon. There was no way to know if it had been surveillance, a pressure tactic, or genuinely coincidental parking. Ethan suspected it wasn't coincidental, but suspicion wasn't evidence, and he'd learned in the past several weeks to be careful about the difference between the two. Darren had seen the car. He'd asked about it once, gotten a short answer, and not asked again. But that afternoon, when they were both working in the main bay and the shop was otherwise quiet, Darren said, without looking up from what he was doing, "How much longer?" 3 days, Ethan said. Darren nodded and went back to work. Chip. Nora Vasquez's editor was a man named Carl Pressman, who had been running the journal's investigative desk for 14 years and had the specific disposition of someone who has published stories that made powerful people furious and has survived the aftermath often enough to stop being frightened by the anticipation of it. He read Nora's full draft on a Thursday, asked for one addition, a request for comment from Grayson Capital, which was standard practice and which Nora had already prepared, and approved publication for Saturday. The request for comment went out Thursday afternoon. It gave Grayson Capital until Friday at 5 p.m. to respond. Miles Grayson received the request through his communications director, a woman named Helen Park, who had held the role for 6 years and who had, in that time, handled a number of difficult media inquiries with the practiced calm of someone who treats communication as a form of damage control. This request was different. It listed 11 specific allegations with document references and asked for comment on each one. Helen read it twice, then called Miles. Ethan didn't know about any of this directly. What he knew was that on Thursday evening, 3 days before publication, Thomas Brierley called him for the 3rd time. He almost didn't answer. He let it ring 4 times and then picked up because not answering felt like a decision he was making out of avoidance rather than strategy. "Mr. Pierce." Brierley's voice was different this time. The measured professional polish was still there, but underneath it something had changed. A tightness. The specific quality of a man who is delivering a message he didn't write and doesn't entirely control. "My client has asked me to make a final offer regarding the Mustang and any related materials." "There are no related materials in the car," Ethan said. "I told you that." "My client understands the situation may be more complex than that," Brierley said carefully. "He is prepared to offer a substantial settlement, not for the car, but for any materials that may have come into your possession in the course of your work on the vehicle. The settlement would include a confidentiality agreement." "No." A pause. "Mr. Pierce, I want to be clear that my client has significant resources and has demonstrated a willingness to file anonymous complaints with regulatory bodies, send someone to park in front of my business, and break into my shop," Ethan said. "Yes, I'm aware of his demonstrated willingness." He paused. "Here's what I want you to tell your client. Whatever he's worried about is already past the point where money fixes it. What he should be doing right now, if he's smart, is talking to his own lawyers about what comes next, not calling me." Brierley was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the Polish was completely gone. "Is there anything?" "No," Ethan said. There isn't. Thank you for calling. He hung up. He sat for a moment in the shop with his phone in his hand and then called Clara and told her about the call. He's panicking, she said. The word wasn't triumphant. It was just accurate, the way you name a weather condition you've been watching approach. A settlement offer with a confidentiality agreement means he's trying to make the problem legally disappear before Saturday. He knows about Saturday? He knows something is coming. The request for comment was specific enough that he'd understand the story is essentially complete. A brief pause. Patricia spoke to Rourke again this afternoon. I wasn't going to tell you until I knew more, but Rourke's unit has obtained authorization for a financial records subpoena. That's all Patricia knows. She said Rourke was careful not to give her specifics, but the fact that he told her at all suggests he wanted us to know things are moving. A subpoena. The word had weight. It meant a judge had looked at what Rourke's unit had submitted and decided there was sufficient basis to compel the production of records that Grayson Capital had been keeping behind the wall of private corporate ownership for years. After Saturday, Ethan said, what happens to you? What do you mean? The story runs, the investigation goes official, Grayson Capital responds. What happens to you practically? Your consulting firm, your case for reopening the civil proceedings. She was quiet for a moment. Patricia believes there's a strong basis for reopening the civil fraud case now that we have the document examination findings. The original dismissal was on procedural grounds. If we can show that the procedural problems were themselves engineered, there's a path back. A pause. I don't know what I recover. The house is gone. It's sold in a foreclosure. Someone else lives there. The company is gone. I couldn't rebuild it to what it was, not after everything. She paused again, and he heard in it the specific sound of someone who has thought about this so much that they've exhausted the grief and arrived at something more like assessment. But Victor's reputation might be recoverable. That matters to me more than the money, honestly. He spent the last years of his life being treated as a failed businessman, someone who destroyed his own company through bad judgment. That's not true, and it's never been true, and it's never been said out loud clearly enough. Ethan thought about the letter. Victor's careful handwriting, the dates across the sections, the months of writing. A man building a record of the truth at a time when no one was listening. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she agreed. The story published at 6 in the morning on a Saturday, which is when the journal's digital edition went live. Nora had sent Ethan a message at 5:58. Going up in 2 minutes. He was already awake. He'd slept badly, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness of someone waiting for something they know is coming. He read it on his phone in bed, the screen too bright for the dark room. Nora had written it the way good investigative journalists write, building from the specific to the general, establishing facts before context, letting the documentation speak before she did. She began with Victor Langford, not with Miles Grayson, not with the fraud, with Victor, who had built a company over 2 decades and had trusted his partner and had spent the last years of his life trying to prove what had been done to him. She described the Mustang in a single paragraph that was better than anything Ethan could have written. A car bought in better times, stored away, lost to an impound lot when the money ran out, sitting in a city facility for 7 years until a mechanic on Carnell Street bought it at auction and found, behind the dashboard, what a dying man had hidden for his wife. She did not use Ethan's full name in the published piece. She'd asked his preference and he'd said first name only, which she'd honored. She described him as Ethan P., a mechanic and car restorer, which was accurate and sufficient. The financial documentation section was dense and thorough. 14 pages of the digital edition with embedded document images, Gerald's analytical summary rendered in plain language that made the numbers comprehensible without oversimplifying them. $14,200,000, 9 transactions, 4 shell entities. A holding company registered in the name of Miles Grayson's wife. The timeline of the fraud mapped against the timeline of Langford Development Partners' financial decline. Diane Cho's account took up 3 sections. She'd spoken at length, and Nora had used it carefully, corroborating the documents rather than substituting for them, showing how what Diane had seen internally matched what the transaction record showed. Her account of being pushed out of the company after raising internal compliance concerns was told in her own words. And the words were specific and measured and more devastating for being both. The forged signatures. 6 contracts. Dr. Park's findings, summarized in precise technical language, and then translated. The signatures do not reflect the natural variation of an individual's handwriting over time. 2 of the 6 show evidence of tracing from an external source document. Ethan read the whole thing. It took 40 minutes. When he finished, he put his phone on the nightstand and lay in the dark for a moment. He thought about what Nora had written about the compartment. She described it the way he'd described it to her: the 4 screws, the painted panel, the careful construction. She'd written, "The compartment was not the work of a man in a hurry. It was built to last, to wait, to survive however long it needed to survive until it reached the right person." She'd written it in the context of explaining what the physical evidence suggested about Victor's state of mind, and it was accurate as reportage, and it was also something more than that, though he couldn't have said exactly what. He got up, made coffee, and called Clara at 7:15. She picked up on the first ring. "I've read it," he said. "I've read it twice," she said. Her voice was not the voice of someone in the middle of relief or resolution. It was the voice of someone who has arrived at a place they weren't sure they'd reach, and is still trying to understand what it means to be there. She did it right. She did. "Victor's name is in the first paragraph," Clara said. "His actual name. Victor Langford, not a businessman or a victim. His name, and then what happened to him." A pause. "That matters to me. I know it seems like a small thing." "It's not a small thing," Ethan said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, he imagined it was the same early Saturday morning it was outside his. The specific quiet of a weekend morning in a residential neighborhood before the day gets going. Birds, distant traffic, the world not yet fully awake. "Patricia's phone has been ringing since 6:15, Clara said. "She sent me a message. 3 journalists from other outlets have already called her asking for comment. The story is being picked up. It'll move fast today." "Yes." A pause. Rourke called Patricia at 7. He didn't say much, but he said the story's publication would not negatively affect his unit's proceedings. Patricia said his tone was, she searched for the word. She said he sounded like someone who'd been waiting for a door to open. By noon, the story had been shared enough times on enough platforms that it had developed its own momentum. The kind of story gets when it reaches people who have their own reasons to care about it, who share it not out of abstract interest, but out of recognition. 3 former Grayson Capital employees who had not been part of Nora's reporting contacted the journal directly after publication. 2 of them had stories that paralleled Diane Cho's. Grayson Capital's response, submitted Friday afternoon and published as an insert within Nora's piece, was 4 sentences. It denied the allegations in general terms, described the documentation as incomplete and taken out of context, and stated that the company would pursue all available legal remedies against those responsible for what it called a coordinated defamation campaign. It did not address the forged signatures specifically. It did not address Diane Cho's account specifically. It did not mention Gerald Okafor's analysis or Dr. Park's findings. Ethan read the response and thought about what it said by what it didn't address. A denial that leaves the most specific allegations untouched is a denial that has already calculated what it cannot deny. Patricia called Clara at 1 in the afternoon with news she'd received from Rourke. A formal notice of investigation had been issued to Grayson Capital's registered legal representatives, requiring the preservation of all financial records going back 10 years. Preservation notice. The step before a subpoena, the step that makes destroying evidence a separate federal crime. Clara called Ethan. "The preservation notice," she said. "Patricia says this is real. This is the thing Victor never got to. Nobody ever made Miles preserve the records before, because nobody ever got far enough." A brief pause, and in it he heard something that was not quite a crack in the careful composure she'd been maintaining, more like the sound of something under long tension finally releasing a fraction. "Victor filed his complaint with the state regulators 6 years ago, and they closed it in 30 days. We just cleared a federal preservation notice in—" She stopped. "In whatever time it took," Ethan said. "In whatever time it took," she agreed. Oops. The secondary complaints against Pierce Restoration stopped after Saturday. Not immediately. There was still the licensing board response to complete, and the drainage allegation was technically still open pending an inspection. But no new complaints appeared. Stewart noticed the silence on Monday and called Ethan. "Someone turned off the tap," he said. "Someone's dealing with more important problems." "Yes, well, I'm going to finish the licensing board response anyway. Cleanest outcome is to close it completely, not just let it sit." A pause. "Ethan, I want to say something and I'm going to say it once." "Okay. What you did, staying with this, not selling the car, not taking the settlement, that was not the financially rational decision. I want you to know I understand that." "I know it wasn't. I also want you to say that I've been your lawyer for 7 years, and this is the first time I've felt like that work was connected to something that actually mattered." A brief, slightly uncomfortable pause, the pause of a man who has said something more personal than he intended. "That's all. I'll send you the licensing board response draft by Wednesday." He hung up, which Ethan was grateful for, because he didn't know what to say to that, and Stewart had efficiently made it so he didn't have to. 2 weeks after the story ran, Patricia's office received notification from the civil court that Claire's petition to reopen the fraud case, filed the day after publication, based on the new documentary evidence and Dr. Park's findings, had been accepted for review. Not decided, not approved. Accepted for review, which meant a judge had looked at the petition and decided it was sufficiently substantiated to warrant a hearing rather than summary dismissal. Clara called Ethan to tell him. "It's not a victory," she said immediately, before he could say anything. Patricia was very clear. Getting the petition accepted for review means we get a hearing. It doesn't mean we win the hearing. It doesn't mean the case gets reopened. It means we get to make the argument. "That's more than you had 2 months ago," Ethan said. "It's more than I had 2 months ago," she agreed. And then quietly, "It's more than Victor had, ever." Miles Grayson had not been arrested. He had not been charged. He had gone largely quiet publicly. No statements beyond the initial denial, no public appearances, the kind of silence that suggests the lawyers have taken over communications entirely. His name was appearing in the financial press in ways it never had before, not in the flattering profile pieces that had been his normal coverage, but in news items, in analyst reports mentioning regulatory risk, in the context of the investigation. His reputation, which he'd spent decades building with exactly the kind of careful, methodical effort he'd used to build everything else, was being revised in real time by people who were reading the same documents that Gerald Okafor had read. The criminal proceedings were a separate matter and would take time. Patricia had explained to Clara that federal financial fraud cases almost never moved fast. They were built carefully, over months or years, because they had to be built in a way that would withstand the kind of legal challenge that someone with Miles Grayson's resources could mount. Rourke's unit was working. That was what they knew. What they didn't know was how long or where it ended. Ethan understood this intellectually. He also understood in a more practical way that some things could not be rushed. You could not put the color coat on a car before the primer was properly cured. You could not rush the metalwork on a quarter panel crease and expect the repair to last. Things that were done right required the time they required, and the time was not negotiable. He was thinking about this on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after publication, standing in the main bay with the Mustang in front of him. The color coat had been done for a week. The clear coat had gone on Monday, 3 coats, and it was curing. The body was essentially complete, the crease in the rear quarter panel gone, the surface smooth, the Highland green deep and correct in the fluorescent light of the shop. He was about to start the final assembly, chrome and trim, glass, the interior that he'd been sourcing period-correct materials for over the past month. He stood there looking at it for a long time. Darren came up beside him. They stood together for a moment in the way you stand in front of something that's taken a long time and is close to finished. "It's the right color," Darren said. "It's exactly the right color." "What are you going to do with it when it's done?" Ethan had known the answer to this for a while. "Return it," he said. Darren was quiet for a moment. "To the wife, to the wife." Another silence. "You're going to lose money on this car," Darren said. Not critically, just as a statement of fact. "I know." "The parts alone, sus." "Darren, I know." Darren looked at the car for another moment. Then he said, "It's the right color." Again, as though the color settled the financial question, and went back to the Chevelle he'd been finishing. Patricia filed a supplementary motion with the civil court on the fourth week after publication, incorporating the federal preservation notice as additional evidence of the scope of the alleged fraud. The motion argued that the existence of the federal investigation, now a matter of public record, since Rourke's unit had issued a press statement confirming the investigation without providing details, constituted independent corroboration of the evidentiary basis for reopening the civil case. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Clara told Ethan about the hearing date over the phone on a Thursday evening, and he heard in her voice something he hadn't heard before. Not relief, not happiness exactly, but the specific quality of someone who has been running a race for a long time and can see for the first time that there is in fact a finish line. Not close, but visible. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks. A pause. Ethan, I want to ask you something I've been thinking about asking for a while. Ask. Why did you keep going? After the break-in, after the complaints, after Brierly called with the settlement offer. At any of those points you could have not walked away but stepped back, given me what you had and said the rest was my problem. He thought about how to answer honestly. The honest answer was not a simple one. Part of it was that he didn't have the right vulnerabilities. No family in the immediate vicinity, no reputation beyond Carnell Street that could be threatened, a shop that was already being targeted and had nothing further to lose from continued targeting. Part of it was that once you'd read a dead man's letter to his wife, written in careful handwriting across 4 pages over several days, the question of stepping back felt different than it did before you'd read it. Part of it was stubbornness, which he'd had since childhood, and which had served him poorly on some occasions and well on others. Because stopping made less sense than continuing, he said. She was quiet for a moment. That's the least romantic answer I've ever heard. I know. It's also probably the most honest. Yeah. Another silence, this one comfortable rather than weighted. The Mustang, she said. How is it coming? 3 or 4 more weeks, he said. The interior is mostly sourced. I'm waiting on the correct seat material. There's a supplier in Tennessee who makes period-correct upholstery for 67 fastbacks, and the lead time is 3 weeks. He paused. The engine runs. I started it 2 days ago for the first time. It needed some carburetor adjustment, took about an hour to dial in, but it runs. Sounds right. What does right sound like? He thought about how to describe it. Like something that was made to do a specific thing, doing that thing the way it was designed to, he said. Not smooth, exactly, purposeful. She was quiet for a moment. Victor would have loved to hear that, she said. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that was better than the silence after it. 4 weeks, she said finally. Let me know when it's ready. You'll know, he said. He hung up and stood in the parking lot behind the shop in the cooling evening, the smell of primer and paint solvent fading from the air, the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood settling into its nighttime rhythms. Across the alley, somebody's kitchen light was on, yellow and warm, the shadow of someone moving past it briefly visible. He went back inside and looked at the Mustang one more time before he locked up. Highland green, deep and correct under the shop lights. Everything that had been wrong with it, fixed. Everything that had been missing, restored. The car that Victor Langford had bought in better times and never gotten to finish, sitting in the bay of a shop on Carnell Street in a state its original owner had never seen it reach. He turned off the lights and left it in the dark, where it had waited before and had learned to be patient. The upholstery from Tennessee came in on a Tuesday, 12 days later than the supplier had promised, which Ethan had anticipated and planned for because suppliers of period-correct materials for 50-year-old cars operated on timelines that had no relationship to urgency. He opened the shipping box on the workbench and went through the contents. Seat covers front and rear in the correct black high-back style, door panel inserts, headliner material, carpet in the right color, and the right backing weight. He checked everything against his order sheet. It was all there, and it was all correct, which felt, after the weeks behind him, like a disproportionate relief. He called Clara. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe slightly less if nothing goes sideways. 2 weeks, she said, and he could hear her marking it. The civil hearing is in 4 weeks. I'd like to have the car before the hearing, if that's possible. It'll be ready. A pause. How are things at the shop? Quiet, he said. Good quiet, not the other kind. It had been quiet for almost 3 weeks. The licensing board complaint had been formally closed after Stewart submitted the full records response, closed without finding, which was the best possible outcome. The drainage allegation from Harwick Property Management had been investigated by the city's Environmental Compliance Office, which had found no evidence of contamination and no violation, and had closed the complaint with a notation in the record that the filing appeared to lack substantive basis. That notation, Stewart had told him, was bureaucratic language for someone filed this to cause trouble, and it didn't work. No new complaints had come. The blue sedan had not reappeared. Thomas Brierly had not called. What had come instead was the ordinary business of running a shop. 2 new project cars taken in, a 69 Camaro with significant rust issues, and a 71 Chevelle that needed a complete drivetrain rebuild. Darren had started on the Camaro's rust assessment with the focused enthusiasm he brought to new problems, which was one of his genuinely useful qualities. The shop had its rhythm back. Ethan had been thinking, in the intervals between work, about what it meant that the ordinary had returned. He'd been thinking about it the way you think about something you don't entirely have language for, circling it, checking it from different angles. The shop felt the same as it had before. The work was the same. He was the same in most of the ways that mattered. But something had shifted in his understanding of what work was. Not what it produced. A restored car, a rebuilt engine, a panel shaped back to its correct geometry. What it meant as an act. Victor Langford had built a hidden compartment with his hands, had taken measurements, cut metal, fitted it into the space behind the dash structure, painted it to match, sealed it with 4 small screws. A craftsman's work, precise and patient, in service of something that had nothing to do with the car itself. The car had been the vessel. The work had been an act of faith, not in any abstract sense, but in the most literal one. The belief that what you build carefully enough and hide in the right place will find its way to where it was supposed to go. Ethan understood that kind of faith. He'd been practicing it for 11 years without ever naming it that. The seat installation took 2 days. Not because it was technically difficult. Fitting period-correct upholstery on a fastback frame was straightforward work, but because he did it slowly and correctly, which were not always the same as fast. He stitched the split in the driver's seat backing himself, using an upholstery needle and the correct thread weight, the kind of repair that no one would ever see but that would hold for another 50 years because it had been done properly rather than covered. He fitted the headliner on a morning when the shop was cool and the material was easier to manage, Darren helping to hold the edges while Ethan secured the retaining strips. The carpet went in on a Thursday. The door panels on Friday. He fitted the chrome trim on Saturday, piece by piece. The bright work catching the shop lights and throwing them back in the way chrome only does when it's new and properly prepared. He reinstalled the instrument cluster, the gauges rebuilt, the faces correct to the period, and sat in the driver's seat and checked every one of them, turning the ignition to the accessory position, watching the needles move. He drove the car for the first time on the following Monday. A test drive. Carnell Street to the industrial park 3 blocks over, a loop through the parking lot and back. The engine pulled cleanly, the transmission shifted where it was supposed to shift. The brakes, rebuilt, new pads, new lines, stopped the car the way they were supposed to stop it, with authority and without drama. He pulled back into the bay and sat in the driver's seat for a moment with the engine running. The car smelled right. That was the thing he noticed. Old cars have a smell that's specific to their era. A combination of materials and chemistry that doesn't exist anymore because the materials changed and the chemistry changed, and you can restore every surface and rebuild every system, but you can't entirely recreate the smell. This one was close, though. Close enough that sitting in it felt like being in 1967. Or as close to 1967 as a man born 11 years after it was going to get. He turned off the engine and sat in the quiet of the bay. He thought about Victor Langford buying this car in better times, which is what Clara had said, in better times, when the partnership was still working and the money was still moving the right direction and the future still looked like what futures are supposed to look like. Victor had bought it to restore, which meant Victor had understood the specific pleasure of the project, the patience of it, the accumulation of small correct decisions into something larger than any individual decision. He'd stored it, kept it. When everything started to fall apart, he'd used it for something else. He'd made it into the most important thing he owned, and then he'd lost it to an impound lot and never gotten it back. Ethan got out of the car and walked around it once, slowly, the way he'd walked around it the first time in the auction lot. The same car, different in every way that mattered. He thought there was something in that worth understanding, and he thought about it for a while without arriving at a neat conclusion, because the things worth understanding don't tend to arrive neatly. He called Clara on a Wednesday and told her the car was done. The pause on the other end lasted long enough that he said, "Clara?" to check the connection. "I'm here," she said. "I'm just... Give me a second." He gave her a second. "Okay," she said. "Okay. When can I... Whenever you want. Today, if you want." Another pause, shorter. "Saturday," she said. "I want to come on a Saturday when you're not rushed. I want to see it properly." "Saturday it is," he said. "Is there anything I should..." "Just come," he said. "There's nothing you need to bring." She came at 10 in the morning, which was later than her first visit. The traffic from Eastport was bad on Saturday mornings, and she'd gotten a later start than she'd intended, which she mentioned when she pulled into the lot and got out of her Honda, and he told her it didn't matter and meant it. She was dressed differently than she'd been the first time. Not formally, but with more care. A good jacket, dark trousers, shoes that weren't the practical default. He noticed without commenting on it. People dress for the things that matter to them, and the way they dress tells you how much. He led her into the shop. The bay doors were open, and the morning light was coming in from the east, and the Mustang was parked in the center of the main bay with the light falling across the hood and the roof in a way that was not staged. He'd simply pulled it to the center after the last wax application. But that worked, the Highland green going deep and complex in the oblique morning light. Clara stopped when she came through the door. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She stood at the edge of the bay and looked at the car. The way you look at something you've been trying to hold in your mind for a long time and are now seeing fully realized in front of you. "That's the color," she said quietly. That's exactly the color it was. "Matched to the original," Ethan said. "There was a section under the roof trim that had been protected. I worked from that." She walked toward it slowly. She put her hand on the front fender, the same fender she'd touched on her first visit, when it had been bare metal. She ran her palm along the surface, feeling the finish. Victor was going to paint it himself, she said. He'd looked up how to do it. He'd bought primers. He had this whole process worked out. A pause. He never got to start. "Someone finished it," Ethan said. She turned and looked at him. Her face had the quality of someone who is holding several things at once and doing it with effort. Not falling apart, not performing composure, just managing the actual weight of the moment with everything she had. "Can I sit in it?" "It's your car," he said. She looked at him for a moment at that, something shifting in her expression. Then she opened the driver's door. It swung cleanly, the hinges rebuilt, no complaint from the metal, and sat down. He watched her settle into the driver's seat. She put her hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way people put their hands on a steering wheel when they're not planning to drive anywhere, just holding it. She looked at the dash, the gauges, the original radio face that he'd had restored with the correct graphics, the correct knobs. She looked at the instrument cluster. She sat there for a while, and he stood at the bay door and let her. When she got out, her eyes were wet, and she was not apologizing for it, which he respected. "Thank you," she said. It came out slightly unsteady, and she let it be unsteady. "Victor did the hard part," Ethan said. "Victor hid the files," she said. "You found them and did everything that came after." She paused. "Don't minimize your part in this. Victor would not want you to." He didn't argue with that. Yeah. They sat in the shop office for an hour after. 2 coffee cups, the door open to the bay where the Mustang was visible, the ordinary sound of a Saturday morning on Carnell Street coming in from outside. Clara told him about the hearing preparation. Patricia was confident in the strength of the motion, though confident was a word Patricia used carefully. The new evidence, the document examination, the forensic accounting, the corroboration from Diane Cho, was substantially different from what had been available for the original civil suit. The original dismissal had been on grounds that required the procedural challenge to have substantive evidentiary support. Now it did. There are no guarantees, Clara said. Patricia is clear about that. We might get the hearing and lose the motion. We might get the case reopened and lose the case. The law doesn't owe me a particular outcome. But, he said, because he could hear one. But Patricia hasn't taken a case she thought she was going to lose in 14 years, Clara said. She told me that. I don't know if it's true, but she said it. A pause. The federal investigation is a separate track entirely. Rourke's unit moves on its own schedule, and nothing about it depends on what happens in the civil court. If Miles is charged criminally, that's a different proceeding, different outcome, different timeline. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I've stopped trying to map all the possible outcomes. I spent years doing that, and it made me worse at handling what actually happened. That's a hard thing to stop doing. It is, she said. I'm not entirely successful at it. A brief pause. How about you? What happens to you now? It was the same question he'd asked her weeks ago, and she was returning it with the same directness, which he appreciated. I go back to work, he said. There are 2 new cars in the other bay. The shop runs. That's it? That's it. She looked at him in the way she'd looked at him on the first day, assessing, but without the wariness that had been there at the beginning. You're not a man who needs a lot of the surrounding material, she said. I suppose not. Victor was the same, she said quietly. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need people to know what he'd built. He needed the thing itself to be right. She looked out at the Mustang. That's a rarer quality than people think. Ethan thought about that for a moment. He thought it was probably true, and he thought the reason it was rarer than it should be was that the world had a great number of mechanisms for teaching people that the recognition was the point, that what you built only mattered if people could see you building it. Victor had spent years being ground down by a man who understood that mechanism and used it deliberately. Take the money, take the reputation, take the legal standing, and all that's left is a man who knows he's right, but can't make anyone else see it. Miles had understood that the truth without an audience is almost the same as no truth at all. The compartment had been Victor's answer to that. Not a perfect answer. It had taken 7 years and a stranger and a chain of events that could have broken at a dozen points. But it had worked, because Victor had been careful and patient and had built it to last, and because the stranger had been the kind of person who reads a dead man's letter and takes it seriously rather than moving on. Ethan didn't think of himself as particularly extraordinary for having done that. He thought it was what any reasonable person would do. He was aware, though, that the pattern of what had happened, the complaints, the break-in, the settlement offers, suggested that Miles Grayson had bet against it, had bet that whoever found the car would take the money or be frightened off, or simply decide that someone else's trouble wasn't worth inheriting. It was a reasonable bet, statistically. Most people, given the choice between $1,200 worth of project car and the disruption that had followed, would have made a different calculation. He wasn't sure what it said about him that he hadn't. It didn't feel like courage exactly. It felt more like the simple inability to do the other thing and live with it afterward. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, the civil court held the hearing on Clara's motion to reopen the fraud case. Ethan drove to Eastport the night before and stayed at a motel near the courthouse because Clara had asked him to be there, not as a witness, the hearing wasn't an evidentiary proceeding, but because she'd asked, and he'd said yes without needing to think about it. He sat in the 3rd row of the gallery with Patricia's paralegal, a young woman named Joy, who had been working the case for 2 months, and who had the slightly wound-tight quality of someone who takes other people's outcomes personally, which was probably an asset in her line of work. Patricia was at the table with Clara. Gerald Okafor was present as an expert witness if needed. Nora Vasquez was in the 2nd row of the gallery with a notebook, there as press. Miles Grayson's legal team was present on the opposing side. 3 lawyers, the kind of 3 lawyers that money buys. Expensive suits, careful posture, a particular kind of confident stillness that was meant to project inevitability. Miles himself was not in the courtroom. His absence was noted by no one officially and noticed by everyone. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The judge, a woman named Judge Adrienne Farwell, who had a reputation among practitioners in the court, Patricia had told Clara, for asking the questions no one wanted her to ask, reviewed the motion and its evidentiary basis in the first hour, asking questions that were precise and that assumed a high degree of familiarity with the documents, which suggested she'd read them carefully before today. Miles's lead lawyer made the argument against reopening. The original dismissal had been correctly decided on procedural grounds. The new evidence was either inadmissible or insufficient to change the procedural analysis, and the forensic accounting analysis was contested in both methodology and conclusion. He made the argument fluently and without obvious weakness. Patricia made the counter-argument. The new evidence was materially different from what had been available at the original proceeding. The document examination findings directly implicated the procedural mechanism by which the original dismissal had been obtained. If the signature authorizations were forged, the procedural basis for the original dismissal was itself fraudulent, and the court had an obligation to consider whether its own prior process had been corrupted by the same conduct that was being alleged. Judge Farwell asked 3 questions of Patricia. She asked 2 of Miles's lead counsel. She asked one of Gerald Okafor, who answered it from the stand in the precise, unhurried way that characterized everything he did. The judge did not rule from the bench. She said she would issue a written ruling within 30 days and thank the parties for their presentations, and the hearing was done. Outside the courthouse, in the gray midday light of a Thursday that had never quite decided whether it was going to rain, Clara stood on the steps with Patricia and Ethan and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. 30 days, she said. That's not a long time, Patricia said. For this kind of ruling, 30 days is fast. Does fast mean anything? Patricia considered this. It means she doesn't need to deliberate extensively, which could mean the answer is obvious in either direction. She paused. I think the answer is obvious in our direction, but I've been wrong before. Clara nodded. She looked at Ethan. Thank you for coming. Didn't have anywhere else to be, he said, which was both true and not the real answer, and she knew it, which is why she almost smiled. But Ken. The ruling came in 19 days, which was faster than 30. Patricia called Clara at 8:15 on a Wednesday morning before Ethan was fully awake. Clara called him at 8:20, and he was awake by the second ring. She granted the motion, Clara said. Her voice was the steadiest he'd ever heard it, which was its own kind of testament to how much it was costing her to keep it that way. The civil fraud case is reopened. He sat up in bed. Patricia's reaction? She said, and I'm quoting, "This is what should have happened 6 years ago." A pause. The ruling is 42 pages. I've read the first 10. Judge Farwell found that the document examination findings, taken together with the forensic accounting analysis, constitute materially new evidence sufficient to overcome the finality of the original dismissal. She also found... Clara stopped for a moment. He heard her take a breath. She also found that there is credible basis to believe the original procedural grounds for dismissal may have been manufactured through the same fraudulent conduct alleged in the underlying case. She used the word manufactured. She put it in the ruling. Manufactured. A federal judge, in a written ruling that was now a matter of permanent public record, had used the word manufactured to describe the legal mechanism that had ended the original case. Victor had known that, had always known that, had never been able to make anyone in authority say it out loud. Victor knew, Ethan said. Victor knew, Clara said. He knew the whole time. A pause, and her voice shifted, not breaking but bending slightly, the way a metal bends under sustained pressure before it finds a new shape. I keep thinking about him sitting in that office or wherever he was when he was writing that letter, knowing that he was right and that the law had been turned against him and that he had the evidence and couldn't get anyone to look at it properly. And now a judge looked at it properly in a 42-page ruling. A longer pause. It took 7 years and a city impound auction and a mechanic on Carnell Street and a dead man's letter and a compartment behind a dashboard, but someone finally looked at it properly. Ethan didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that added to that. He just sat with it, on the other end of the line, and let it have the weight it had. The federal investigation moved on its own schedule, as it always did, as Rourke had always suggested it would. The formal criminal charges against Miles Grayson came 5 months after the civil case was reopened, not as a single charge, but as a 17-count indictment covering wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The obstruction count related specifically to the conduct that had occurred after the Mustang sold at auction, the attempts to recover or suppress the evidence, the pressure campaign, the anonymous complaints. Rourke's unit had built that section of the case from the pattern that had started with Brierley's first call and ended with the licensing board complaint. Ethan learned about the indictment the same way most people learned about it, through the news, on a Tuesday morning, a brief item that ran below a story about a city council vote. He read it on his phone while his coffee brewed, and then set the phone down and finished making his coffee and thought about it while he drank it. The charges were not a verdict. He understood that clearly, and Patricia had been saying it from the beginning. Charges are the beginning of a legal process, not the end. Miles Grayson was entitled to defense, to trial, to all of the mechanisms that the system provided. The outcome was not predetermined and would not be fast. But the indictment itself, 17 counts in a federal court, under the signatures of prosecutors who had reviewed Gerald Okafor's analysis and Dr. Park's findings, and Diane Cho's testimony, and the transaction records that Victor had assembled in a storage facility and hidden in a car. That was something that could not be undone. Once it existed, it changed what Miles Grayson's name meant. Not in a tabloid way, not in the way of reputation destroyed by allegation. In the more fundamental way of a record that would exist permanently, a document that would be there for anyone who looked. He called Clara. She'd already seen it. "How are you?" he asked. Honest answer? Yes. "Tired," she said. "Genuinely, physically tired. I've been running on something for months, and now that something is gone and I'm just tired." A pause. "Not badly, the good kind of tired, the kind you feel when you finish something." "You haven't finished. The civil case is still going." "I know, but that's different. That's the legal machinery doing what legal machinery does. My part in it is mostly done. What I had to do, what Victor needed done, that's done." A pause. "The car is in my garage. I look at it every morning when I leave for work. I don't drive it. I'm not sure I ever will, but I look at it." He hadn't asked about the car since she'd driven it home, said. She'd come back to the shop with a friend to pick it up, on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks after her first visit, and he'd handed her the keys and the ownership documentation he'd had transferred to her name, and she'd driven it out of the lot on Carnell Street under its own power, which was more than it had done in years. He'd watched it go from the bay door and then gone back inside. "You don't have to drive it," he said. "I know." A pause. "What would Victor say about that, do you think? Restoring a car and not driving it?" Ethan thought about this genuinely. "I think he'd say that's your call," he said. "He finished the letter and he didn't know if you'd ever read it. He built the compartment and didn't know if you'd ever find what was inside. He wasn't doing it for the outcome. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do with what he had." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous reading. Maybe, but I think it's right." Another silence. "Are you always this certain about things?" "No," he said. "Mostly I'm uncertain about most things, but some things are clear." The civil case settled 14 months after Judge Farwell's ruling, in a negotiated resolution that came after Miles Grayson's legal team, confronted with the federal criminal proceedings and the accumulated weight of the documentary evidence, concluded that fighting the civil case to trial was not a viable strategy. The terms were sealed, as civil settlements often are, but Patricia called Clara after it was done and Clara called Ethan that evening. "It's over," she said. "The civil case." Patricia's terms? She said more than she expected and less than she hoped, which she said is exactly what a good settlement looks like. A pause. "It's enough to rebuild." "Not what I lost?" "You don't recover what you lost. That's not how this works. But enough to start something real again." "What are you going to start?" She was quiet for a moment, and the quality of the quiet was different from all the previous quiet pauses he'd come to know in their conversations. Lighter, not burdened. I've been talking to a woman who runs a nonprofit that provides legal support to small business owners facing exactly the kind of predatory practices that Victor dealt with. People who get taken advantage of and don't have the resources to fight back through the legal system. She needs a director of operations, someone who understands business, understands what it's like to have everything stripped away, and understands how to rebuild. She paused. I understand all three of those things. When do you start? I haven't said yes yet. When do you say yes? A brief silence, and then something that was, he was fairly certain, a genuine laugh, short and slightly surprised, the laugh of someone who has rediscovered that they're capable of it. Probably tomorrow, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Victor would have liked that. I think so too. She paused. Ethan, I want to say something I've been thinking about saying for a while. Say it. What you did, not just finding the files, but staying with it. The complaints, the pressure, all of it. I know you said it made more sense to continue than to stop, and I know you meant that, but… She paused. There are people who do the right thing because they've calculated that the cost of not doing it is higher than the cost of doing it. And there are people who do the right thing because they're the kind of person who does the right thing, and the calculation is just the story they tell afterward. She paused again. You're the second kind. I want you to know I see that. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He was in his car in the parking lot behind the shop, which was where he'd come to associate certain kinds of phone calls with, the parking lot having become its own geography of significant conversations. The evening was coming in slowly, the sky going from gray to darker gray, the lights in the restaurant across the alley already on. He didn't argue with her. He thought she was probably right, and he thought arguing would be a way of deflecting something that deserved to be received directly. Thank you, he said. Thank you, she said. For everything, Chad. He thought about it for a long time afterward. Not about whether she was right, but about what it meant. About what kind of person does the right thing because they're that kind of person, before the calculation. What he arrived at, slowly, over the weeks after the civil case settled, was this. It's not a virtue you claim for yourself. You don't decide to be that kind of person through an act of will or intention. You find out what kind of person you are through what you do when the situation is ambiguous, when the cost is real, when no one is watching and no one would blame you for the easier choice. Victor Langford had found out in a storage facility, building a compartment, writing a letter to his wife. Ethan had found out in a city impound lot, looking at a rusted car he'd paid $1,200 for, and then in his shop, with a dead man's letter in his hands. You don't know what's inside you until something asks. The problem. And he thought about this too, because he was not a man who stopped at the comfortable part of a conclusion. The problem is that most people never get asked in a way that's clear enough to reveal the answer. The asking usually comes sideways, dressed as something smaller than it is. A phone call you could not make, a letter you could leave sealed, an offer you could take. Miles Grayson had built an entire career on the belief that most people, given a clear enough choice between their own comfort and someone else's justice, would choose their comfort. He had been right often enough to build something substantial on that belief. He hadn't been right this time. Ethan didn't think he was exceptional. He thought he'd been in the right place, with the right set of limited vulnerabilities, and that he'd done what he could with what he found. The distance between that and heroism was real and worth maintaining. But he also thought there was something true in what Clara had said, something that had been there before the calculation, underneath it, that made a certain set of choices feel like choices, and another set feel like they weren't really options. He thought that thing was worth protecting, worth being intentional about, in the ordinary days when no hidden compartments were asking anything of you, in how you do the work, in whether you do it right when no one's checking, in the small decisions that don't feel significant but are building the kind of person who makes a particular decision when the significant one arrives. Victor had built a compartment in a car. He'd done it carefully. He'd done it right. And 7 years later, it had done exactly what he needed it to do. Well, spring came to Carnell Street the way spring always came to that block. Gradually, then all at once, The same 3 trees along the sidewalk going from bare to green in the span of what felt like a week. Ethan opened the bay doors on the first warm Monday of March and let the outside air move through the shop, the smell of it different from the shop's usual atmosphere of metal and chemical and oil. He was working on the '69 Camaro, which had proven to have more rust than the initial assessment suggested. The left rocker panel was worse than he'd thought, and he'd had to make the decision to replace it rather than try to save it, which was always an expensive decision, but the only honest one. You couldn't patch metal that was fundamentally compromised and call it a restoration. You could call it something else, but not that. Darren was doing the preliminary teardown on a new project, a '65 Mustang coupe that had come in the previous week, a different car from a different year, with its own specific set of problems and its own specific history that Ethan would learn over the months of the work. Every car had a history. Every car was someone's story about what they'd wanted and what had happened and what they'd done with it. Ethan had always understood this. He understood it differently now. He was under the Camaro, working on the rocker panel supports, when his phone buzzed on the workbench. He finished the fitting he was doing before he got up to check it. A text from Clara. 3 months in at the nonprofit. It's harder than I thought and better than I hoped. Thank you for everything. I'll be in touch. He read it twice. Then he put his phone back on the workbench. Good news? Darren called from across the shop, because Darren had an uncanny ability to sense when information had arrived. Yeah, Ethan said. The Mustang lady? Yeah. Darren appeared around the corner of the car he was working on and looked at Ethan with the specific expression he wore when he was going to say something that was more perceptive than his usual operating frequency. You know, you could have just kept that car, he said. Made $100,000. Never gotten into any of this. I know, Ethan said. Would you do it the same way again? He thought about it genuinely for a moment, not performatively, actually thought about it. The complaints, the break-in, the calls from Brierley, the sleepless nights, the months of work that had cost him more than it had made him. The letter in his hands, the sound of a 390 FE big block turning over for the first time in years in a shop on Carnell Street. Claire's hands flat on the workbench, Victor's careful handwriting. Yeah, he said. Same way. Darren looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, that particular nod that meant he'd asked the question and gotten the answer and it was settled, and went back to work. Ethan went back under the Camaro. The work was the same as it had always been. Metal and time, patience, and the willingness to do it right when the wrong way was faster. Nothing about that had changed. He had not changed, not in the fundamental way. But he understood something now that he hadn't before, or had known without understanding, about why the work mattered. Not just as a craft. As a commitment to the idea that things made carefully, made honestly, made with the intention that they should last and function and serve the purpose they were built for, were worth the time they required. Victor Langford had understood that. He'd built a compartment that lasted 7 years and then found exactly who it needed to find. He'd done the work right when there was no guarantee it would ever matter. Ethan thought that was the whole of it, really. That was what you had. You did the work right as you could make it, and you trusted it to find its way to where it was supposed to go. Sometimes it took 7 years. Sometimes it took longer. Sometimes you didn't live to see it. But it got there. Outside on Carnell Street, the morning traffic moved through the ordinary machinery of an ordinary day. The 3 trees were green. The shop was open, and there was work to do, and Ethan Pierce picked up his tools and got back to it.